Okay, could I have everybody's attention, please? I'm going to call to order the November 13th meeting of the Finance Committee. The agenda is on your screen. It's essentially consists of review of the capital budget. Any additions to the agenda, changes? No? Okay, I'll move that the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Okay, great. And then we'll move the minutes of last meeting. Were in the agenda package. It essentially consisted of review of the operating budget. So I'll move that the minutes of the November, what was the date of that meeting? 6th meeting be approved as presented. Those in favor? November 8th. Sorry, November 8th meeting. It was Thursday, that's correct. All right, and then I'm going to pass it off to Michael Fark, who will walk us through the capital budget. Mike.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're there. Okay, good morning, everyone. So yes, we're going to talk about the capital budget. We're actually looking at a 6-year capital plan. Historically, we had done a 5-year, but with the recent council-approved changes to the budget process, where we've gone with a 2-year operating with an additional 2-year plan, we've actually moved it from a 5-year to a 6-year capital, just because it makes the rolling nature of it more straightforward. So I'm going to walk you through quickly. Here's the agenda, the planning process, an overview of capital, the funding framework, and then we'll go through the departmental priorities and talk about the specific projects. So first of all, planning process. As always, when we look at building out our capital budgets, we start with Council's strategic framework. The majority of capital is in the MIM group, but the corporate services and municipal services both have a share as well, but they go through a similar process. So on the left, as always, you see your strategic goals, community engagement, etc. What I really want to draw your attention to is the 6 council priorities on the right, because these are really what informs our capital planning process. And you may recall we had discussions around how many priorities there should be, because every priority comes with a price tag and with a cost, and we're gonna have a lot of discussion around that today. But as you can see there is under community update and advance the downtown enhancement plan. Can we sharpen that image up at all? Like it's no? Okay, then I'm going to read off the computer here. We have, again, a priority around transportation, intercept parking, and then looking at paid parking and fare-free transit, amongst other things. Livability, around continuing to advance the agenda on affordability and affordable housing. New in this strategic plan is environmental sustainability. In this particular case, there was a move towards zero waste and exploration of organics, but there are a lot of other components around environmental sustainability that we're going to talk about today. A strong economy, so economic diversification is a council priority, and then again new this year is wildlife coexistence, a focus on, as a result of the Wildlife Roundtable and the Human-Wildlife Coexistence Report, trying to take a look at that and see how we can do things there better. And then, as always, again, we come up with all of our master plans and strategies, of which there are many, and we use those to build out our budgets. What was interesting this year is the starting point for the MIM group was we took pretty much all of these plans and we looked at what were the goals, objectives, targets of those plans. We said, okay, if we were actually going to deliver on these, what would that look like? And what it looked like was far more than we could afford. And so obviously then there was a process of prioritization. But each one of these plans contains a combination of ambitious targets, some that are attainable in the immediate term, some that are more long-term, and again, some that are more ambition as opposed to what you could reasonably accomplish. But there are a lot of plans up there, and they all include a lot of recommendations of things that we should be doing. And we felt that it was important that we actually reflect those plans in our planning. So if these plans are saying that we should be doing things, then we should be taking that should seriously. There was a further contributing factor that really drove the capital plan this year as well. And that was the IPCC report that came out in 2018. I don't know how closely Council may have followed this, but for some of us in administration, this one really added a sense of urgency. So the 2018 report essentially highlighted that the rate of global warming, essentially the rate of climate change, is actually far exceeding the models that they had previously put together. And what we're seeing is change at a rate that is more unpredictable and having more impact than the original models had suggested. One of the most interesting things that they have said about this is that it really is now up to government. So the scientists are saying, look, we are at a critical phase, meaningful action needs to be taken, and government needs to lead that. Given that at least two of Council's priorities focus around environment and wildlife, we wanted to take that seriously, and we wanted to demonstrate to Council what leading on the environment would look like. And so just a couple of highlights from the IPCC report. The first one being that we're expected to be 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels by 2030 now, and that has a significant impact. And everybody who was here for 2013 and the flooding then knows what that impact could look like for us here meaningfully in the valley. What that means is weather extremes have been detected over a time span, basically what they're saying is even 0.5 of a degree makes a difference, and that they can detect that, and that extreme weather events have greater risks and impacts to human health, livelihood, assets, and ecosystems, including from heat waves, heavy rain, drought, and associated wildfires. So we have had both heavy rain, we've had drought, and we've had wildfires here in the valley, and all within the last few years. So we don't have to look very far to see the true impacts of this. And then, of course, the climate-related risks to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth are projected to increase with global warming of 1.5 degrees and increase further once we hit 2 degrees. So we wanted to take Council at your word when you set environmental sustainability as one of your priorities, and we wanted to show you what it would look like if we were to actually try to lead on this and try to make some meaningful contributions towards our own carbon footprints. So as with operating, our budget development process is fairly straightforward. The department teams created their business plans and budgets to align with the strategic plan. Then our CST met and went over it to get the big picture. That big picture, as I said, was very expensive, so we had to go back and do some refining of the budget and make some adjustments to align with the budget guidelines and the capital funding envelope. We are going to have a longer conversation about the capital funding envelope today as well, because there are different ways of looking at it. And one of the changes in approach that we made this year is rather than setting an envelope number and essentially trying to cut to fit within that, we wanted to look at both sides. So we wanted to look at what it would look like to actually deliver meaningfully on Council's priorities, and then what were the assumptions that we make around budgets and what the envelope looks like that impact the funds that we have available. And so we talked about this a little bit last week, in that if you always make conservative, very, very conservative assumptions on what your funding envelope is, and so you spend very conservatively, and you make very conservative assumptions around what your growth is going to be, so you're underestimating your growth, what you get is two paths, two lines that continue to diverge, right? So we underspend, and then what happens, we're not actually keeping up with the growth because our assumptions are too conservative. We underspend, and then we get hit with these points where we are behind. We have infrastructure deficits, we have operating deficits, or we are having to make some big steps to catch up. So we wanted to be a little bit less conservative in our estimates this time around, and we'll talk about how that impacted how we looked at the funding envelope. So just a couple of quick points. Introduction to capital assets, because there are some members of council for whom this is your first real kick at the budget. So first of all, defining what they are. What are capital assets? So they are used in operations. In general, they have an initial life in excess of 1 year. So assets that we acquire with a lifespan of less than a year, we don't consider to be capital. We consider those to be operating assets. They include land, buildings, building improvements, vehicles, machinery, equipment, even works of art and infrastructure are all capital assets. Capital assets also include all amounts that are directly attributable to the acquisition, construction, development, or betterment of the asset. So when we do road replacement or we do paver patching, well, paver patching is something we're switching, but mill and overlay, when we're doing road rehab, that is all capital investment, because what it's doing is it's extending the lifespan of the asset that we already have. And it also includes studies, plans, and other projects that may be considered as a maintenance of existing capital infrastructure. So, for example, we do a utility master plan update every 5 years. We consider that a capital plan and a capital project because it is intended to provide us with the guidance we need to maintain our assets. So that's the general definition of what we expect to find within capital. And if at any point there are any questions, feel free to interrupt, of course. Councillor Sanford.
The last point that you made, it's not just for infrastructure though, right? The plans and studies?
That's correct. Yeah. So we did a broadband master plan study, that was out of capital. Fire master plan was out of capital, yeah. Org review is out of capital, absolutely. So anything that, again, studies, plans, and other projects that may be considered as maintenance of either existing capital infrastructure or that are intended to guide how we manage as a town. So
that's something I didn't used to understand, was that studies all come out of this capital budget.
Yes.
So anything we do, not just relating to capital, right?
Yeah. Also because they tend to be a one-time cost.
Right.
Right? And so it's not appropriate to put them in. I mean, if we had to put the $200,000 for the org review in operating, for example, that would make a big difference to the operating budget, but we only plan to do the org review once, not every year.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to understand.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the year, when it actually does happen, behind the scenes, we in finance actually take it out of capital and charge it to operating. It happens for the audited statements, that's where it really happens, but for budget presentation, it doesn't.
Yeah.
So is that where you get your transfers and other? Is that part of the transfer process? Okay. So it's transferred to operations and paid out of that? If you, that's funding. Yeah. Is that what you mean?
No.
Oh.
Do you want to come up and maybe explain,
do you want to just
Rick,
explain
because I
that?
think you may have actually,
Yeah, the transfer from operating to capital is funding. That's a straight $960,000 that's sent over to fund. So there's an entry that does that. What I'm talking about more of, say, the org review isn't a capital asset. So when we, at the end of the year, up in finance, when we do our TCA and all the depreciation and all that kind of stuff, the org review wouldn't be part of that number. It would be charged to operating down kind of below the line.
So TCA is tangible capital assets. It's a reporting requirement that we have with the federal government. And so if we spend capital money on something that doesn't follow the classification of a capital asset, what Rick is saying is that then that gets charged over to the operation side of things, but it gets funded from capital.
So that's what you're saying, it's budgeted in capital, but for accounting purposes, essentially, because it doesn't really have much to do with us, right? So.
Exactly. It's more for the audited statements. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Then I wanted to talk very quickly about the capital project priority categorization. So this is essentially what we do is when we look at all of the different needs and demands within the organization, we do a prioritization and we use this process. So we give them a letter grade, essentially, with A being absolutely necessary. So anything that is legislated or regulatory or a matter of life safety or critical to existing asset or service integrity, that automatically gets an A. And we'll go through several examples of what those are when we get into the sort of line-by-line capital budget discussion. B is beneficial, and it must meet one or more of those criteria, which is high level of community expectation and or needed to maintain current infrastructure or service levels and or long-term efficiency, cost savings, economic benefit, and or aligned with council priority. So if it's only one of those, it doesn't necessarily become a B. It may end up as a C. If it's one or more, then it generally gets a B rating. John, you look like you have a question.
No, sir.
Okay. So C is needed but could wait if it is necessary. So those are new services, infrastructure or programs, service, infrastructure or program enhancements, aesthetic improvements, response to increased community dev, and are nice to have or can wait. And then D is a category that we struggle with a little bit because there's a lot of worthy projects that we have in D that we think are actually worth pursuing that would bring benefit to the community. But in light of all the other priorities, they end up in a delay, which is essentially, it's a project enhancement or one that is nice to have. It only benefits a few. It has a significant cost, or it has significant operating costs. And what ends up happening is we put projects in D that are sort of funding dependent. So if we were to, example, get a specific grant for a specific project, a good example is Quarry Lake. So there are enhancements to Quarry Lake that are included in the capital plan. They are dependent on us getting the funding from the Rocky Mountain Heritage Foundation. If that funding comes forward, then we would go ahead and implement that project because it is a good project that responds to a number of community needs. Without that funding in place, we would not implement the project. Right? So that's essentially where all those types of projects are ending up in Ds.
Question.
Yeah.
So what if you have 10 projects in D that are interfunding dependent, and they all come through simultaneously? How do you manage the human resources to implement all those?
Right. So what we've done is when we build out our budget and business plan, we looked at implementation capacity within the departments, and we include within that implementation capacity the likelihood of at least some of the D projects coming forward. The reality is that we don't ever anticipate a scenario where all the D projects would come forward, and if they did, we would have to do a reprioritization about workload, and we may decide not to pursue some of them because of workload constraints. But at least some of them are factored into the workload, assuming that some funding will come forward.
So if like 30% of them get funded on the alternate funding, you can absorb that?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
But not 100%?
But not 100%, yeah. And we would never anticipate that we would get funding 100%.
That would be a lucky day.
Yeah, unless, of course, the city of, town of Canmore won the lottery.
Planning on winning the lottery,
so-
Vi, is that the deal?
Yeah.
No, you are, and then you're going to donate it all.
Yeah.
Just to that point, if there was funding coming along for a D project, there's good odds that that funding would include the cost of resources, so.
Yeah, at times, yes.
Because I think that's what we did with the Legacy Trail too, right? We had a funding contingent, and the funding came through, and then it was done. But
Yes.
the opportunity arose, but we took the opportunity when it arose.
Right. And I mean, one of the things we've gotten better at doing these last couple of years is there's always unexpected things that arise throughout the course of any budget cycle, and we need to allow capacity to respond to those things. And so historically, what we were doing is we were essentially programming work at 100 or even 105% of our capacity. And then when the unexpected things would arise, floods, that sort of thing, we would find it very difficult to find the capacity to deal with that and the existing workload. So you remember the engineering WIP list, for example, was very long for a number of years after the flood because it took them several years to catch up due to the constraints. Now, a flood is an exceptional event of a very large magnitude, but there are other smaller scale things that come up on an annual basis that we just need capacity to respond to. So we've done a better job these last few years, and I think in this particular budget we've done a better job of allowing ourselves some space to deal with what we know will arise. We just don't know what it will be. So we've left a little bit of space for the unplanned work. Just want to make a quick note. So there are 5 projects that are carried over from the last budget cycle that we need to have a conversation about. Fairly straightforward. So the bottom 3 are very easy. They were in the 2018 budget. We did not spend any money on those, and we are proposing to essentially cancel those projects and not bring them back in 2019. However, the top 2 projects, the data center firewall and the public washrooms at Riverside Park, are now included in the 2019 budget. The data center firewall is just a straight across. We canceled it from the previous year. We're bringing it forward into this year. It's at the same value. The public washrooms at Riverside Park, unfortunately, were canceled and are coming back, and they are coming back at a much higher price. And so that is currently included in your budget, and that we'll review those more carefully when we go through the budgets line by line. But just to highlight that these are projects that were from the previously approved cycle.
So that increase on the Riverside Park washrooms, does that reflect better analysis of the cost, or does that reflect the cost of delaying?
So it's not related to delay. Essentially what happened is we didn't realize we didn't actually own the land. So there's a parcel there that's actually owned by the province, and so we've been having to deal with them. And so the combination of the process we need to go through and then the requirements for what the facility looks like and actually some better understanding of what the true cost will be has resulted in the cost increase.
So some of that cost increase then is because we have to meet whatever terms or standards the province?
That's right, yes.
Oh, sorry. And so the 3 items that are just being canceled, whatever their funding sources, they would just go back to that funding source and create part of the surplus? No.
It's not surplus. No, it goes back.
It goes into capital.
That's right. It just stays.
Right.
It contributes to the funding envelope that then we are looking at this year. That's
Perfect.
right.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question about back to Riverside Park? Are we going to build our washrooms on provincial land? Are we doing a land swap or?
So we're currently in discussions with the province about what exactly that should look like and whether or not they should. It's one of those remnant parcels where it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the province to retain ownership of it. There are a number of those in the community that we're currently talking to them about. So we haven't actually finalized the decision with them about what to do with it, whether we'll take the land or whether we'll get an LOC basically to do it on their land.
Okay, thank you.
Before you move on, Mike, those 3 projects that are canceled, why were they canceled?
So in the case of the first one, actually the first 2, we were working with the province on those, and we actually needed provincial permission and in some cases provincial cooperation to do them, and the province just wasn't ready. And so you may have heard about this, there's the Canmore Area Trail System, which is a provincial-led initiative. They are trying to revive that, but essentially they weren't in a position to move forward with them, so we weren't in a position to move forward with them either. The secondary suite incentive program, we just got 0 uptake. Right? People were not applying for the program, so we've taken it out of the budget.
And for 19, was it going to come forward again?
So we have not included it back in the budget for 19. The idea is that we're going to make the changes to the land use bylaw, and then based on the updates to the land use bylaw, we will revisit it at that point to determine whether or not it's a future program that we would like to reinitiate.
Okay, thanks.
So let's talk a little bit about our funding framework. So every year when we go through the budget process, we are meant to report on our debt and reserve policy statistics. So Council has set some policies. So the first column there is the policy provision. So the top line, for example, it says percentage of debt limit used. We must use less than 70% of the debt limit. And what you can see in the values through there is based on the capital plan that we have put together and that we are bringing to you today. In 2019, we're using 47%, 2020, 41, then it goes up to 53, 50, 50, and 49. So even though we are bringing forward what we feel is a robust capital plan, that plan is still very much respecting and not contributing to a significant increase in our debt. So we believe it is a responsible plan that we are bringing forward. Then you've got a policy around percentage of debt maturing within 10 years. It has to be less than 50%. And you can see, it's 15.8. We're fine there. Percentage of debt servicing limit used, again, less than 70%, and you can see that we are well below that. Percentage of municipal taxes used to fund tax-supported debt servicing costs must be less than 15%. In 2019 and 2020, which is the approved budget, we are significantly below that, at 5.5% and 4.1%. And then percentage of utility user fees and levies used has to be less than 22%, and we're at 16.9% and 18% respectively. So within the utility model, we do make use of debt at a higher level than we do in the general capital program. And we do that due to the long-term nature of all of the assets within the utility and the funding model that we have in place for that. But even still, we are well within the council set policy. And then there are a few other policies there. Average interest rate is 4%. Average interest rate maturing within in 10 years is 4.4. And average interest rate maturing in greater than 10 years is 3.5. So our interest rates continue to be quite reasonable. I'm going to skip over the bottom portion of this chart because I think we have a better explanation for it a little bit later on about where exactly we are in our reserves and what that looks like. But then at the very, very bottom of the chart, you can see where we're at in terms of other policies. So tax stabilization, the policy states that we must do a minimum of 1.2 in 2019. And 1.3 in 2020, and a maximum of 2.9 and 3.0. Rick, maybe help me out here. So that's the tax stabilization, the minimum, and the target. So we are, you want to just...
So tax, you'll see in a few minutes, but so tax stabilization minimum is, well, 1.2, we're at 1.8, so we'll talk about that in a minute. General operating, minimum of 2.1, we're at 2.2, maximum of 4.2. And the other one is the corporate operating reserve, or contingency, corporate contingency, and we don't have anything in the corporate contingency at this moment. And the 250 is the...
Right. But we'll have a more in-depth conversation around the reserves and whatnot shortly, because we think there's a better way to represent this. Okay. Yeah. So this is just a high-level representation. So 2019 funding by source. You can see that of the capital projects, we are funding 16% from debt, 37% from grants, 6% is a direct transfer from operating, and 41% from reserves. In 2020, the picture changes a little bit. In that we are taking a higher percentage in debt and slightly less in reserves, and a little bit more in grants and a little bit less in operating. And then you can look at who the big spenders are. So in 2019, utilities is 26%, engineering is 31%, solid waste services 17%, public works generally 13%, and then a small amount in IT, other, and facilities. And in 2020, similarly, the utilities is the big consumer there, 45%, 30% in engineering, and then the balance spread out between the other departments. So this is your capital expenditures for the planning period 2019 through to 2024. This basically shows how much we are spending each year. So in 2019, we are proposing to spend essentially 17 million, 17 in 2020. 2021 is a big year, it's a bulky year, and the reason for that is because included in 2021, we have $12 million for a new fire hall. And the reality is that that is a big asset that you need to acquire all at once. It comes with a big price tag. We can't stop doing all the other things that we need to do at that time just to make room for that. So the regular work that we do on the utility maintenance, streets and roads, transportation, etc., needs to continue despite the fact that we need to acquire that bigger asset. So it's lumpy in that year, and then you see the remaining years taper back down to more moderate levels. Overall, we're at an average annual capital spend of about 19 million, which we feel is reasonable and affordable. And then you can see on the right-hand side there, it just looks at the breakdown between what is utilities and what is operations. So utilities always forms a large percentage of our capital expenditure every year. And that's things like upgrades or life cycle replacements of the wastewater treatment plant, is deep utilities that we need to replace whenever we do road works, those types of things. Then we look at our grants balances. So on the left-hand side there, you can see sort of where we started in 2019, and then they go up and they go down. One of the things that we wanted to do a little bit differently this year was consider how we look at grants. MSI, for example, so we made some conservative assumptions around how much MSI funding might be available to us in future years. But given that we have operating reserves and capital reserves for a reason, we didn't see a reason to treat grants like a reserve as well. So we were more aggressive in terms of how much we drew down on MSI. MSI money is money we should be spending. It is money that we need to use to support our infrastructure, and it's money that we should be spending. So we drew down more heavily on MSI than we have historically in the past because we didn't want to leave that, or we didn't want to increase that gap between what we're spending and what we need to be spending to maintain our assets, basically. And then on the right-hand side there, you've got your, yep.
So what are the assumptions right now on MSI in the future?
So we will get to that. In fact, Rick can hand out the form right now, and you'll see exactly what those are. So we've got our reserve balances for you here.
We have details about it.
Yeah.
But you're making some assumptions as to what future MSI grants might be.
That's correct. And we are assuming that, and we'll pull them up here in a minute. You want to put it on the overhead, Rick?
Might as well.
Oh.
Maybe I'll just jump in here. With regards to the MSI grant, I think Council's well aware that the grant program is wrapping up and that the province has committed to replacing it with legislated formulas in the Municipal Government Act. For those of you that went to AUMA, I'm not sure if you went to any of the sessions around what the province is proposing. I don't think they've landed on something firm yet, but the intention is that there will be an infrastructure grant program that will be legislated as opposed to this last one, which was a 10-year program that got extended and spread out for longer. So we're still waiting to hear the details of what that legislative program will be. That's unknown yet. Though the MSI, the current MSI is a combined formula of per capita and assessment. Do you know, Rick, do you know the percentage of assessment that's included in the formula? No. So I'm not 100% certain on the exact formula, but we had advocated very strongly to include assessment in the formula so that our secondary home base gets included. And certainly we'd be trying to push for that in any kind of legislation moving forward too.
Yeah.
Do you want to press your button there?
There'd be other communities as well outside of Banff, Canmore, and Jasper that would benefit from that, such
Right.
as Sylvan Lake or some of the summer villages,
Yep.
all of that stuff.
Yep.
Nice. Thanks.
So you,
One other question. So in the 2018 column, it's projected balances. So the MSI projected balance at the end of the year is 6 million.
that's right.
So
Yes.
we're pretty close to the end of the year, so we must have a pretty tight idea of that.
Yes.
Pardon me?
That's in the bank.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not actually projected, it's actual.
That's right. So we've got, as you can see, your starting balance in 2019 for MSI is 6 million. Again, the argument that we're making is that there is no reason to keep the MSI reserve, essentially to leave that money unspent and that high, given that we have a capital reserve specifically for a reason. We're essentially, part of our argument was, if we continue to do this, we are treating MSI like another reserve, rather than spending it on infrastructure that we actually require, which again broadens that gap between what we're spending and what we need to be spending. So you can see that as we go down outwards towards 2024, that the balance gets lower, and we've made what I feel are extremely conservative assumptions on what we would look at for funding in 2022, 2023, and 2024 at $2.5 million. That is essentially half of what the current funding is. I believe that, you know, even with a potential change of provincial government and some austerity measures coming forward, this would represent essentially almost a 50% decrease in funding to municipalities. I think the municipalities would mutiny in that type of scenario. So there would certainly be some challenges if it were to be reduced by that amount. But we made those assumptions just to be sure that we are absolutely not leaving ourselves in a difficult position. But even with these assumptions, the capital plan that we're bringing forward is one that we feel is affordable and responsible. But you can see that at the end of the 6 years of 2024, we are down to a $2.4 million balance in MSI as opposed to a 6.1. And if I have my way, even that we will spend as we get closer to the end there, and we make the next set of budget assumptions the next time we go through the budget process. Yeah.
The reason 2019 kind of stands out, there's an only addition of $2 million. Our normal allotment in the past few years is around 4.5. Back last March, they advanced us about $2.9 million. I guess the way their budget worked or whatever like that. So we're assuming we're not going to get an additional on that. So that's one of the reasons why the 6 million is so high. It's inflated by an advancement of around $3 million.
And so, since we've got this up here, I think it's probably worthwhile that we walk through all of this. So, starting on the first page, which is the general capital reserve. Yeah. There we go. So this is your general capital reserve at the top. We start off in 2019 with 9 million, which is again a bit of an accounting issue that I think Rick can, maybe it's better that you just explain why that is so much higher than all the previous, or all the corresponding years. Do you know why? Yeah.
Because we're in there is a transfer to asset replacement. So part of the long-term financial plan was to set up an asset replacement reserve, which hadn't been set up until a couple of years ago. Part of the long-term financial plan was to, as of this budget cycle, to transfer $4 million from general capital to the asset replacement reserve. So you'll see 4 lines down there, there's a credit of $4 million transferred asset replacement, and there's a corresponding transfer.
Right. So the opening balance for 2019, in absence of that, actually should have been around 5 million. And then as you see, as we go down over the corresponding years, We draw down on that slightly, but we still leave a reasonably healthy reserve in place. Photo radar, we are essentially proposing to empty the photo radar and spend that money to support the projects that they are designated for. The Art Trust, I'll let Sally speak to the Art Trust, but it's
This isn't accurate, actually.
oh, they have a different plan?
Yeah, but it's in my slides, so
Okay.
ignore this one and we'll
Yeah.
split it in a little bit.
Yeah, and same thing with economic development. There is a reserve there that Sally can speak to how they are planning to spend that. Then, as Rick mentioned, there's the asset replacement reserve, including the $4 million transfer from capital. And you see that that one continues to grow. So by the end of 2024, the asset replacement reserve is a quite healthy $9 million. It's one of the reasons why we feel we can justifiably spend down the general capital, because general capital is meant to support acquisition of new assets. The asset replacement is meant to support the essentially life cycle maintenance of assets.
Did you say we'll be talking about the Economic Development Reserve later?
We can, I mean,
Wasn't mentioned, but we can
Okay,
work that.
so
Let's
just a question I have then is the additions are, so that's not all of the funding that's collected through the business tax?
The
So-
additions?
Yeah, additions.
So the Economic Development Department is, when we set it up last year with council, it's self-funded through those. So the payment of staff and all that. So the additions are, the way the budget is set up right now, and this shows more in the operating budget, but so the department is self-funded through the business licenses, but they have budgeted for a surplus every year to continue to fund that reserve. So historically, that entire amount for the last couple of years since the CBT dissolved has just been sitting in economic development reserve. We're now starting to spend that, but we are budgeting for a certain amount every year to go into the reserve. Does that help?
Yeah.
And the revenue is conservative. So right now for this year, we're up to almost 400,000 in revenue, and the budget for 2019 is more at 370. You know, until we get a sort of consistent department who's really looking at and managing that, we've budgeted conservatively and built in an addition to the, yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I just had a question where in the economic development line under 2019, where it says capital funding in brackets, that's representing the capital project that we have here in our binder,
Correct.
right? Okay, just wanted to be sure. Thank you.
okay, so that's economic development. Asset replacement, as I indicated, is one that we continue to contribute to on an annual basis. And within the planning window, we are essentially meeting our reserve targets there as required. Similarly, for the flood mitigation maintenance, same thing.
I just, on the flood mitigation one, I wanted to point out to council, because this is one where your budget guidelines had indicated we were to increase our contribution by $50,000 per year. In 2019, the $100,000 addition did not have the $50,000 increase. That's what we provided in 2018. But you'll see that the planned increase, or the planned contribution goes up by $50,000 each year, so that we're building that reserve. The intent, of course, for that reserve is to do mitigation work following our next flood, to clean out the debris behind the debris retention structure, those kinds of things.
Yes, John?
The asset replacement, there's the transfer from general capital of $4 million. Is that just a one-time transfer just to establish the reserve?
Yes. Okay. Turning it over the page. So our utilities also have reserves and reserve policies and reserve targets. So you can see where we're at with the water utility, which is a fairly consistent number. Yes, John?
Sorry, what's that at the bottom of the first page? Other specific reserves? Yeah,
It's $30,000 that was left over from debt we took for Stoneworks Creek.
Yes.
so that went into,
It's in a specific reserve. When you take debt for any specific project,
right,
you can only spend the debt on that
so
project.
that's money left from work that's been done that's being held for future work on that creek.
It has to be specifically.
Yes, and we do have it included as a funding source for the work on that creek in the budget going forward, assuming the rest of the funding source comes forward, the rest of the grant comes forward. Yes. So again, then looking at our water utility reserve balance, and Andreas will go through this in more detail as well when he brings forward the utility model next week. We do a whole day just on the utilities and or a whole session just on the utilities and what that looks like. But essentially what we're showing here is both for the water and the wastewater, our reserves are more or less in line with where they are meant to be throughout the planning period. And same thing with solid waste services, the recycling and the collection. And then we look at PAH. So at this point, there are no planned draws down from the PAH reserve over the funding window. That will be dependent on what CCHC decides to do and if there are additional projects that they want to move forward. Yeah, Joanna?
So the chat rewrite, I didn't see that in the capital plan.
Yeah.
Is that something that CCHC is going to lead in 2019?
So first of all, we're not planning a rewrite of the CHAP. We're planning an update of the CHAP.
Okay.
And so we are expecting to do that, and that's included in the work plan within planning.
Okay.
So we are including that within the resources that we have
Okay.
there. We're not expecting it to be a major project.
Okay, thank you.
The housing needs study that was led by CCHC
Yeah.
and will inform that a fair bit.
Okay.
Yeah, John?
Just a couple of questions. Under the water and wastewater solid waste utility reserves, the transfer is showing as a one-time transfer, but would that be, I mean, wouldn't there be a transfer every year? No. So why is there one-time transfer?
Up until a couple of years ago, I'm trying to remember when about 2 years ago, they were all one reserve. There was one water utility reserve and one solid waste services. And we had the study done. It said to separate them and separate them out. We kind of basically, at the time, we just basically split them by 50-50. Over the last couple of years, it's the numbers has worked. It made sense within the models to do a one-time transfer. So it's all within the same.
Right.
It's just between the two reserves. So.
Similar to the asset replacement reserve.
Similar to that, yeah.
Okay, one other question. Oh, in the PAH reserve, we're expecting the acquisition of the Mountain Havens units to resell them, and that would replenish the reserve?
Well, so that's an interesting question. When council transferred the money to CCHC, it came with no requirement for those funds to be returned back to the town. So yes, in theory, CCHC will sell those units and then they will recover those dollars. But then at this point in time, they would remain with CCHC unless council decides that they want to require that those funds be returned back to the town to be put back into the reserve.
Let's make a note to do that.
Okay.
Because that's a town reserve.
I would agree, the intent and the discussion at council and with the CCHC board was that those funds would replenish the reserve. However, it would be a CCHC decision how quickly they would sell those units and whether or not they wanted to hold them and keep them as rentals depending on demand, et cetera. So,
Yeah, for sure.
And then, so one of the other things that we looked at, and perhaps Rick can speak to this as well, was a little bit on the off-site levies. So off-sites are a bit complicated because what we bring in and what we spend out depends entirely on the rate of development, what occurs. So what we bring in depends on what development takes place. So in 2018, for example, we collected some fees, some significant fees that we hadn't necessarily anticipated, and so that has increased. And then over time, we will spend out some of that money on projects meant to support that infrastructure.
Yeah, we budget very conservative. The additions, I mean, I know for 18 they're going to be, roughly $1 million likely, but it all depends what comes in. But only projects that are specifically in the model can be funded out of there. So, and those are exactly accounted for. So.
And then we have the rec levy, and quite frankly, I have no idea what that is and why it's there.
It's like your appendix?
Yes.
No, so
Interesting,
the
I don't have one of those
recreation
anymore
levy
either.
was a volunteer levy. Now that the new Municipal Government Act allows us to collect levies for recreation facilities, we need to do some work to look at what our future recreation needs are for the community, what would be required for growth, what would be attributable to just existing development, and then have those discussions with the development industry. So the rec levy, could start to grow and be used to fund new recreation projects moving forward.
So a question, when the volunteer rec levy was being used in the past, was there sort of like a suggested per door amount?
Yes, yep, there was a formula, and we negotiated that with BOTA. It was $700, I believe, per door. Very, very few people contributed.
Well, we got almost $1 million for Elevation Place out of the rec levy.
Yes, we did.
And I believe initially it wasn't voluntary.
That's correct.
For a few years, and then it became voluntary.
Yeah.
Right around the time I got
Yeah,
elected.
it was a mandatory levy, and then there was a challenge against the city of Okotoks, and based on that challenge, ours went voluntary. And then the new MGA allows us now to collect it, but there has to be a formula, it has to be negotiated with your development industry, so that's something we need to do moving forward. We can also collect levies for things like fire and police infrastructure, new fire halls, new police halls, those kinds of things as well.
So there's a couple of projects in the 2019 budget that are rec related. Why wouldn't we draw that reserve down for those projects now? Like why would we carry a $23,000 balance in a rec levy?
Well, they would have to be for growth. If they're replacement, if they're playground replacements and it's not a growth element, it doesn't meet the spirit of why the funds were collected. So there were certain projects identified. If we proceed, for example, with the new tennis facility, that would be a facility that is being built to meet the growth demands of the community, so that would be an eligible project, for sure.
So the eligibility has to be based on growth as opposed to life cycle replacement?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So I'm going to try to speed us along here because we're running, we have a full program still ahead of us. We're planning to essentially spend down most of the bear bin money. That will contribute towards organics. Cash in lieu of parking is something that we will revisit when we talk about the potential for intercept parking, but there could be some discussion that we would have there, but we're currently not planning to spend that unless we move forward with that project. And then cash in lieu of MR is also, has to be used on very, very specific purposes. We've drawn that down, so a majority of what used to be in this reserve went towards the rec center. And so we don't have, this is not something that we collect a lot of money on, generally speaking, so we are not proposing to use it for much at this point. And then as we'd already talked about, so you've got MSI, there's where the balances are. We went over this already, essentially very, very conservative assumptions of $2.5 million in the final 3 years of the capital window. I think there's good reason to believe that it should be higher than that. We are essentially proposing to completely spend down the federal gas tax because again, that is money that we should be using on an annual basis to support projects.
And just before you leave that page, Mike, sorry. There is the total capital reserves line that's shown there in 2019 at 25 million and increasing slightly annually to just under 34 million by 2024. So, you know, a healthy capital program averaging between 17 and 19 million per year, but still, you know, the reserves aren't getting depleted to do that. Reserves are being maintained, and that's the whole concept of the capital envelope that I'm sure Mike will talk more about.
Okay, can we flip back to the other?
Can I ask another dumb question? How is the federal gas tax calculated?
I think it's per capita, is it not? Yeah, it's per capita.
Per capita? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, flip back to the other.
Thank you.
So just a quick look, we love these graphs, just showing what our total projected debt and total projected debt servicing are over the window. So obviously in 2018, the blue number is the existing debt, and you can see that over the next 6 years, we take on some debt and then we pay down some of the existing debt, but we still remain very much within the total debt and debt servicing guidelines of council. So we still leave ourselves considerable room and comfort to work with there. Which we've already gone through the handout. And so again, the argument of administration is that historically our capital spend on average was a little over 16 million a year. Now we're bumping that up to a little over 17 million a year over the over this window. Actually, plus the fire hall, right? 17 million a year plus the fire hall. So including the fire hall, it's 19 million, a little over 19 million a year. We actually still believe that this is a responsible and affordable capital plan, but that it is also required to move forward on council priorities. And so with that, I'd like to move into the departmental overview. I'll start by welcoming Therese from Corporate Services. I think this slide accurately sums up what everybody thinks about corporate services.
Thank
you.
You likely will want to follow along tab 5 to 9 handout. To explain the reference on the big handout, the detail page numbers on the left-hand side. So we need reference back to the detail page numbers on that.
These binders themselves are a labor of love.
All right, so we'll turn to page 22. I'll just help you follow along in order. We'll start with general corporate services. The project, we've got two projects here, one in 2019 and one in 2020. You'll recall last week at council you heard that we are a lean organization and we need to address our resources in order to effectively deal with the volumes and complexity of work that we're facing both now and into the future. These two capital projects are intended to support the implementation of the organizational review and to really address and leverage the strengths that we have within the organization to build our capacity. And really what we're looking at here is wholesale process review in order to improve our efficiency and create some of that capacity while maintaining an ability to stay flexible and responsive to the general public and what they're looking for. We are early in the implementation phase of the organizational review. As you heard last week, we're actually just working through the end of this year and finalizing which recommendations we will be bringing forward. So we anticipate that these funds will be a combination of consultant support for process review, but we may also determine that we need to implement some other perhaps systems or processes that we don't currently know or are not aware of. And so we've maintained some flexibility there to be able to address what it is that will come up. You'll see as we go through the IT projects, for an example, creating a 311 service. This would be one of the recommendations that was in the organizational review. As part of the telecommunications study in IT, we will explore what that looks like, and we will then understand how and when we can implement that. So it may fit within one of these projects, or we may need to come back with a new project once we better understand the scope of that work. Are there any questions about the organizational review?
No.
Okay. Then we can move on to page 38 is the start of our IT projects. Within information technology, we have a combination of life cycle projects and also some new items that we're addressing. And from a life cycle perspective, you will have seen this before in budgets. We replace all of our hardware, both laptops, computers, but also our network infrastructure. And these project summaries just show what that life cycling looks like over the course of the next 6 years. You will notice a bump in 2022, and that's because some of our major network infrastructure is due for replacement at that time. Otherwise, we have a fairly level replacement cost as we move forward.
Just a question.
Yes.
So the PC life cycle and new equipment on page 38, doesn't that happen every year that there's replacement?
Yes.
So in the 5-year spreadsheet, it's not reflected every year?
Yep. Project 38 is the life cycle replacement cost for 2019. Project
Right.
40, the one below, is the life cycle replacement cost for 2020.
Right.
And then you'll see an amount addressed annually moving forward.
Yeah, I was thinking there was a different, like, the first one is replacing, updating desktop PCs.
Yes.
And the other projects are other types of IT infrastructure, servers, routers, switches, and it's, so the specific to the updating desktop PCs, doesn't that specifically occur more regularly?
That occurs annually, and that would be the first 3 lines under information technology, which is PC, life cycling, and new equipment. The following 3 lines are the infrastructure. So there's 2 separate components to life cycle replacement. One is PCs and individual pieces of hardware, and the second is the IT infrastructure, which is servers and the broader infrastructure needs to support.
The justification
Yeah.
sheets are page 38 and 40.
Yeah, and then 42 is the life cycle of servers, routers, switches, and
Right.
so on.
So I get it. I'm just curious why 38 and 40 aren't reflected out.
They are, John.
They are,
52,000. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 lines into the future for 52 grand.
Keep looking down.
42.
He's
There's
looking.
just no
No.
justification
There's no
sheet.
justification sheet past the 2 years, so this is it.
Oh, okay, I was looking at the justification.
No.
Right, so we only put in justification sheets for the 2 years.
Yeah, there are
Okay,
only
it's here.
justification sheets for 2019 and 2020 projects.
Yeah.
Because those are the 2 years you're approving.
I get it.
Yeah,
Okay. So moving on to the more specific projects within IT that would be considered new, we do need to review our offsite levy modeling software. That's page 46 in the justification sheets. We had identified in 2018 with the offsite levy bylaw that we needed to do an in-depth review of the dwelling and accommodation unit numbers and related to our assumptions around offsite levy modeling. And we also identified that our current software is somewhat unstable. We have a specific consultant-generated software, and we need to ensure that we have the best option out there for ourselves. So we have actually put out an RFP pending approval of this project so that we can start this right away in the new year, given how important the offsite levy function is to the organization. Okay. Moving on, the EDRMS project on page 48. This is a continuation of the 2018 project that was started by the Municipal Clerk's Office in conjunction with IT. This has efficiency and records retention implications for the organization, and would be a project that would continue spreading throughout the organization. Supports the automation of some of our processes as well, which is why it's very important. For example, accounts payable electronic invoice distribution is contingent upon the rollout of SharePoint. Page 50 is our telecommunications study, which is really a study to understand our mobile and device needs as an organization, and to standardize and enhance the mobile options that we have available. It also includes the investigation of the 311 service, which I mentioned earlier. So it really is reviewing how any mobile devices feed into our system and support our processes. That includes the portable electronic signs that you see. It also includes the software that's used to manage traffic lights, so it's anything external feeding into the organization's systems. Just stop me if you have questions. Page 52 is an e-services project. This supports directly what we're moving forward with the organizational review from an IT perspective. So we have identified that we have multiple software systems within the organization that don't speak to one another. What this requires is that residents using our system have to enter their information multiple times or log into multiple systems to be able to do business with the town. It also means that internally we're doing the same thing. We may provide a resident with a form that they have to complete manually, and then we have to enter that information into the system. And so there's some real opportunities here for efficiency and improved processes with this project. Okay. Next is our data center firewall. That was a carryover from 2018, which is, has really a security focus on our data and our systems to ensure that we're not corrupted. Page 56 will be taking place in 2020, which is a phase 2 of the implementation of CityView, which is our new planning software. And what this phase of the project will allow is public-facing online services to be the focus. So the ability for the public to book an inspection online or to check on the status of a building permit. So phase 1 is being undertaken right now and through the balance of 2019, and phase 2 would then occur in 2020. Page 58 is a implementation of IT strategic plan initiatives that were identified in the strategic plan that came forward to council, including network assessment, some bandwidth assessment, a cloud strategy, a number of items, again, behind the scenes to support the electronic nature of our work. And then finally, we have page 60, which is the disaster recovery plan. This is a 2-phase project, 2020 and 2021, which allows for the ability to ensure we are prepared in the event of the disasters or unexpected major events that might occur, to still be able to access our networks and information and to still be able to conduct business. So the first phase is how do we recover that information in a disaster. The second phase is what's called business continuity planning, which is how do we plan for continuing business in the event of a major catastrophe or disaster. And then just as a long-range item, I noted the phone system replacement. 2023 we will be due for phone system replacement. It's just a one-off but high cost I thought I would just mention. And that's it for corporate services.
Any questions on the IT projects? No?
Okay.
Okay.
Moving on to our friends in...
Okay, so municipal services is scattered throughout the book. It's not quite as linear as corporate services, so I'll try to flip you through pages. So economic development is the very first justification sheet, number 20, page 20. And there's 2 significant priorities that will be moving forward in economic development. The first is the strategic plan. We have applied for a CARES grant, which would cover half of the 90,000 that's needed here. So we're hopeful that we'll get that grant, but we have budgeted the full 90,000 to come from the Economic Development Reserve, just in case we don't. So that's completely ECDEV reserve funded. And then the second is broadband.
Sorry, what was the grant you applied for?
CARES, C-A-R-E-S. And then the second starts on page 30 on your justification sheets. And there's two, this is one of council's priorities for broadband. So there's really two things in order to move broadband forward. The first is the planning study, which is in right now 2020 for 50,000. And that is really to figure out, you may recall we had the broadband strategic plan done. This was in the plan the next step. You really need to figure out if you're going to go ahead with broadband, your operating model, and how it's going to work if you are going to go forward. And then the actual network design, which is the installation of the backbone and creating the actual broadband. Currently that is unfunded. It's in as part of the 6-year plan, but it is not funded to begin. So we would do the planning study in 2020, and then in part we're waiting to see on the Olympic decision. And there's several other things happening, both provincially and federally around broadband that may create some funding or other opportunities. So broadband is in the plan, but the network design itself is actually unfunded. Questions on ECDEV? Okay, otherwise I'm going to move then to arts and events. And arts and events are on page 28 and 32, because one is 2019 and one is 2020. So in 2019 and 2020, there are two temporary projects. One is another one on Mindside Trail. You may remember, I can't remember if it was this year or last year, there was a temporary installation on Mindside Trail that was very popular. And then the second is the Walk in the Woods, which is between the TransAlta and the Nordic Center as part of the Cross Country World Cup. So both of those are funded from the Art Trust. Both of those are temporary exhibits. And then as we discussed at your last Finance Committee meeting, we are recommending no contribution to the Art Trust in 2019. Yeah, go ahead, John.
So the Mindside Trail project, is that meant to dovetail with the World Cup event?
No, I believe it's summer for that, for the Mindside one. So the one dovetails with the other, and the other is more seasonal. It's about pulling in summer visitors. In terms of the question about the Art Trust, here's the 5-year plan. The one that I mentioned earlier that Mike had didn't have this update in it. So here's the 5-year plan, both of what you'll see there's contributions of $54,000 in every year, except for in 2019. And then various capital projects that are being funded. And then every year there are annual adjustments for conservation and maintenance. In summer, there's an intern, a public art intern. They do a mentoring program as part of the Mayor's Spotlight. In 2019, they're spending some additional dollars, and in 2021 on the video. The temporary public art is in there, and then in 2021, they're talking about looking at a rotating art space. I have a few questions about that before we actually move it forward in an approved budget. But you'll see with all of these various ins and outs, at the end of 2022, there would be an ending balance of almost $17,000 remaining in the Art Trust if they were to do everything that's budgeted in their 5-year plan. And again, that's an if. Questions about that? Yeah, go ahead, Esme.
For the capital funding, in 2019, so we talked about not putting in the 54,000,
Correct.
and then 2020, is that suggested as well?
No, it's back in. So if you look at the Art Trust, the second line where it says additions,
Gotcha.
that's actually the contribution of the Art Trust. So just 2019 is empty,
Okay.
but it's in 18 and then 20 and beyond. The capital funding, those are years where there's a big art acquisition.
Oh, okay.
So in 2018, that will be the Tony Bloom piece.
Right.
That's already been commissioned. In 2019 and 2020, there are no new pieces coming in. In 2021, there's a plan for a smaller regional competition, and then in 2022, another larger competition. So that's what's in the plan.
And that 54 that we didn't put in, we're not planning to put that in at some point later on.
It's just 0 for 1 year, but in all the other years, it would be as it has been.
Okay.
Go ahead, Vi, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. The public art walking trail, I guess, is it the winter one? You've got a summer one and a winter one? Or?
Yeah, one in each year.
Okay. There's a new trail development up towards the Nordic Center now. Are they going to use that new trail development for that purpose?
I'm not entirely sure. I think it will just depend on where that is at. So do you mean the extension of the Legacy Trail? Yeah, right. That would be the idea, is to use the most accessible trail to get folks there. And you may remember a couple years ago when we had the really big World Cup, I think it was 2016, they did a walk in the woods there that was really well received, despite
I went on that one and it was great, but there were times through that process where it was really slippery and icy.
Yeah, right.
So that new Legacy Trail extension might be
a better option, correct.
Good. Thanks.
Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
The rotating art space that shows in 21, 22, don't have to have all the details now, but thinking in the future.
Yeah, so what that is, the idea, and you may recall the last time that the Arts and Events was in front of council to approve a location. One of the locations that was looked at was right out in front of the Arts and Events office here, on that little sort of odd island. I don't know what to call that.
It used to be trees.
Right, feature that's there. But it's to actually engineer that so that smaller pieces could be leased for a year. So the idea in 2021 would be to create that as a space, and then starting in 2022 to bring in rotating pieces. I have a couple of concerns about that project, which is why it's not happening right now until 2021. One is, again, contingent on the Olympics and the downtown enhancement. We may want to see changes to that area that may make it not feasible in the way that it currently is configured. And second, this is a lovely idea, but my concern is that it could be fairly intensive in terms of staff time. That's a very small team that tends to have a good bit of turnover. And so acquiring a piece in a rotating way every year is a contract and a commission and engineering work and managing the artist, and there's a lot to manage there on an annual basis. And so I would like to make sure that that program is set up in a way that it's a manageable workload for staff, especially if there are turnovers or people off. So it's not until 2021, so we can do a further bit of exploration on what that might actually look like. But it is an idea of the Public Art Committee, and I think it's an idea worth looking at.
But I see that each year there will be proposed temporary public art, like the walk in the woods and all that.
Yes, right. For every year, that's what they have proposed right now. Right now, all we're asking for is approval for the two, for 19 and 20. But those, as you know, are quite well received and popular, and so they are trying to do those on a regular basis. Any other questions about arts and events? Okay, I'm going to move on to the municipal clerk. In the municipal clerk's office, page 26, is the shared information governance. So this year, with the town of Banff, we got a grant to look at the possibilities for shared information governance services. That report is just being finalized. I know Cheryl just got the draft of it last week. And so this capital project is a placeholder to implement some of the recommendations from that. The town of Banff has also been asked to make a contribution to whatever that would be, but this is looking at ways that we can work in a more regional, collaborative way on some of our things like records management and information policies that both municipalities have to have, and instead of working separately on them, is there a way that we can collaborate and work together? So this one is just about implementing the results of that report, which we don't yet have, but it's being finalized. And then pages 34 and 36 are two currently unfunded projects. These are simply digitization of paper records in planning. One is the planning and development building plans, and the other is land files. And these are important projects. Right now, the planning department, if you've been in the file room behind the front desk when you walk into the main, that room is a big paper room, and staff have to often spend a lot of time going through paper files to try to find things. So the idea is if we could digitize them, it would be a process improvement and a time-saving improvement. But again, it is just something that, given the capital envelope, we were able to unfund.
I have a
question with regards to that. So, with regards to, those piles were there when we had our flood a few years ago in the Civic Center. Were those piles of paper affected in the flood in the Civic Center?
I believe Mike might be able to speak better to this than I can. I believe they were not, that there was some maybe water damage, but I don't think we lost anything significant. Yeah.
But would that be something, would we treat our other corporate documents in the same fashion in terms of they will sit in a corner somewhere and when we get around to digitizing them, we will?
Yeah, I mean, we have a storage locker of records, and that we are, right? So, and I don't know if you've been by Catherine's old office, the manager of finance's office, right? Yeah, we're doing other, so we have a lot of paper. Even bylaw still, bylaw writes paper tickets, and we have to keep a record for a certain amount of time. So we have a lot of paper that, we'll get to, and digitizing is efficient when it's done, but it's very time consuming.
Oh, no. Anybody that's ever had to to scan all their family photos.
Well, and we're not doing the scanning. We're just preparing the records for someone to scan, but you have to do things like remove staples and make sure they're organized and make sure they're, so it's quite time consuming. So we recognize that we need to do more digitization, but it is what we do as we are able right now. So that's part of why those projects are unfunded. Mm-hmm. Currently, yes, it's historic. Yeah. Most things. I couldn't speak for everything. There are, which is part of some of what Therese just presented. We're actually trying to move us more and more in that direction. Right now, organizationally, we are not 100% there. We're getting better, but we need to do more. So it would depend on the department and the system, whether or not we still have paper or if it's all digitized. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So both that project and the next one on 36 will be carried out by existing staff with some assistance. So we're trying to reduce that kind of drain on the existing staff resources. It sounds like a lot of work for somebody.
It's a lot of work for somebody, but what we found is that it's like, for example, what we have right now in finance, we actually have somebody in finance who's going through those boxes because finance knows our records and they know what we need. And so then we've backfilled somebody at the front desk who we can train fairly quickly on answering the phones and financial systems so that somebody in the department can actually look at the record and make the judgment call. So it would be done as much as possible with existing staff, but we'd have to bring somebody in on a backfill to free them up to be able to do that work in order to do the digitization.
I see. So the contracted work would to do the job that the staff is normally doing so that they can do the digitization?
Yeah, the contracted work has two parts. One, we do work with a contractor to do the actual scanning. So the digitization of the actual record is done offsite by a contractor. But we need staff to prepare the records to send them off to digitization. So we'd backfill those staff so that they could prepare the files. So it's really two different contracted services there. But again, both of those projects are unfunded. We're just drawing your attention to them as something that was put in that we are not able to do currently.
Right.
Okay. So next is protective services. And protective services really has two categories of work: life cycle replacements and new projects. So the first life cycle replacement is the breathing apparatus, which is on page 68. These are what firefighters use to breathe when they go into fire, and they have a life cycle and a regular system of maintenance, so this is just a regular life cycle. Then there's vehicle replacements on page 62 and 66. 62 is the Master Stream appliance. This is the 2015 new pumper truck that we just received. It was budgeted in 2015, we received it in 2017. It was capital project number 1508. When we originally got this vehicle, it was purchased in the US, and because of conversion rates, this is the last piece of equipment for that vehicle. We couldn't afford it with the original capital budget because of the conversion to US dollars. So this is really just finalizing a piece of equipment for that new vehicle. On page 66 is the replacement of the rescue truck. The rescue truck is currently a 2000 vehicle, so this will be at a 20-year life cycle in 2020 to replace that vehicle. I will note, if you look at the long-term capital plan, there's not a justification sheet for it, but the ladder truck is also up for replacement in year 4 or 5 or 6 of that capital plan. When that vehicle is replaced, all of our vehicles will be have been replaced in the last 5 to 6 years. So this is just, again, part of regular vehicle life cycle maintenance. They usually last 20 to 25 years. And then in fire, there's 2 new items. On page 64 is the forcible entry tools. And this is, again, another completion. So the vehicle from 2017, the 2017 budget, it will be received hopefully in January, February of 2019, is our second pumper truck that's being replaced. The old pumper, this is a new set of tools, forcible entry tools. The old pumper did not have room. With the design of this new vehicle, as it was being designed, they realized that there is new space. So this is a request for a new piece of equipment to go on this truck that we will be receiving shortly. So it is a new set of tools. Gesundheit. Yeah.
So do we already have?
We have one set. This would be a second.
So this would be a second set.
So it would be a second set, yep. And then the other item is on page 70. This is the sprinkler protection unit. This project is currently unfunded. And for those of you who went when they recently were testing the sprinkler protection unit up on Benchlands and over in Larch, that was a borrowed piece of equipment. This would be that we would own it ourselves and have it in storage so that if there is a fire coming, we don't have to ask somebody in a community 4 hours away if we can borrow theirs and they can drive it here. This would be us owning it. But again, it is currently unfunded in the capital budget. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
Just curious, I would have made it something higher, more important than a D. D is pretty low priority.
It's a D because it's unfunded.
It's a D because it's unfunded. So D is not low priority. If you look back at the criteria from the presentation that Mike did earlier this morning, D does not mean it's a low priority. It just has to do, there's several criteria that make something a D. It's not a C, which is a can wait, but it is a D based on those criteria.
So on that list of determinations, so the projects and enhancement are nice to have, only benefits a few or has a significant cost. So this is a D because it's
significant cost, and it is a nice to have. We have been able to manage fire protection in the valley without it. It is a question of mitigating risk, but if there were a fire coming and we had time, we might be able to borrow one from another community. It's a bit of a question, and there's always a bit of a question about how much gear you have for what might happen. And there's a finite quality to how much of that we can afford and store.
Yeah, and my understanding is that the province does have this equipment, and so it's not 4 hours away. It can't, I mean, if it's being used in another community, it could be 4 hours away, but it is readily available from the province. And that's whose equipment we were using.
Depends on the nature of the emergency.
Yes. It depends, and the size of the fire.
We could be
and
left high and dry.
Yes, we could. We could. But I think it's also important to know that having this doesn't mean a wildfire wouldn't happen in our community. It would be one system and one mechanism, but it wouldn't necessarily mean we're saved because we have it. Yeah.
No, but I would.
You would save 25 to 30 structures.
Right.
Who knows?
Who knows? Which is, again, also part of why it's a D.
Well, okay, I walked the line, and it was much more comprehensive than that. They sprayed down entire neighborhoods, so.
The line I walked, they could not get the water uphill. So I'm not trying to diminish the importance of this project, but I think it's important to recognize that there are constraints with what this piece of equipment is capable of doing, which is also, again, part of why it's a D. Council is welcome to include it into the budget. It's why we highlighted it as one of the things that we didn't fund. Council could decide to include it. I'm just explaining to you why we didn't fund it and why it was listed as a D. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Then the last one in municipal services is recreation. Recreation has 2 relatively small projects in. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so when it comes to approval time, it is showing on the capital planning summary at 150,000, although it's a D. So in order to make that project occur, there would have to be a motion first of the finance committee to move forward with that D project.
That's correct, with and specify the funding. where you'd like it funded from.
Okay.
Okay? And then last are 2 life cycle projects in recreation. The acting manager of recreation has indicated that there is actual efficiencies in doing these projects both at the same time. So one is climbing floor replacement, and this is really the replacement covers. So the padding is fine, but the cover that covers the padding that climbers land on is starting to wear, and so we will reuse the padding, but we need to replace the cover. It just becomes a hazard after heavy. Do you have a question? Oh, okay, sorry. Just holler if you do. And then the second is a replacement of the Rocktopia wall, which if you've been in the climbing gym, the Rocktopia wall is the fake rock wall. It looks like an actual outdoor wall that currently is underutilized because it's an awkward design. So the idea here is a redesign which would increase its use and increase its safety and also increase some capacity in the climbing gym. We could get a handful more climbers in there when it's already busy and at capacity. So we're suggesting doing these 2 projects at the same time because there's efficiency of, you could put the Rocktopia wall in while the floor is up and being worked on. Yeah, go ahead.
And is it safe to assume that that wall would increase revenues?
I think you could make that argument. It's hard to say. So will it, right now, what it could do is just allow 5 more people who already have a membership to come in when it's full. That's not necessarily an increase in revenue. There are other times where people may want to come to specifically use the wall who don't have a membership who would pay. So it could increase revenue. I wouldn't be comfortable saying it absolutely will. It has the potential to, but I don't know how significant an increase that will be. And that's it from municipal services. Any other questions?
So this is being proposed for 2019 budget, right?
2020.
Oh, okay.
You'd approve it now as
Sorry.
part of the 2-year plan, but it would happen in 2020.
All right,
Yep.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to suggest we take a potty break. If nobody has any more questions, maybe we could come back for 10:45. Okay.
We have a lot to get through still, so please be back in your seats by 10:45. capital projects, simply because the volume of the ones in my area are significantly larger. And then I'm also going to bring Andy in because I would like to give council a specific update and overview on the transportation network. So over the last few years, there have been changes. So at one point, there were signals at 8th and 8th, for example, and we want to update council on where all those things are at. So I'm going to be bringing in Andy shortly. But to start with, let's just really quickly talk about planning. Apparently, Alaric was inspired by Randall's Boda roast because he found this and decided that it was... Yes, let's move on.
That's not an Alaric thing.
Well, he is.
My eyes.
Yes.
Apparently there was some sort of boat joke about me.
Yes, yes. Okay, so I would like to keep our discussion as much as possible focused on this sheet here. And we will only reference the justification sheets if necessary.
Gonna be necessary.
Right now on page 10 on planning.
Yes.
Page 10.
This, he says, don't look at the justification.
Yeah, well, I'm looking.
Justification sheets are important.
Yeah, he can ask me to do anything he wants, but
Live by them.
Yes.
Something not in them that should be.
So we can reference the justification sheets. We can reference justification sheets when required, but in planning the big capital projects that we have for 2019, land use bylaw updates. So this is a conversation we've had, work that we've been trying to do with various incarnations in-house for the last several years. The combination of trying to do it in-house and having significant development pressures at the same time has made this challenging. Council's requirements for public engagement on the land use bylaw are also extensive. So we are proposing to bring in a consultant to manage this process, basically from first reading, which we are going to be doing later this month, through to third reading of phase 1, and then the entire process for phase 2.
Just a best practices question. Land use bylaws are meant to be rewritten every 5 years, is that the number?
No, I mean, generally not, because so there are
Or
annual...
not rewritten, but like I think our last major update was 2011.
2012, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So, all right.
Well, and just on that, it's similar to the Municipal Government Act or any other legislation, right? Is that you can build on it, you can amend it, but a wholesale change that, similar to what we're proposing, is a rare
Well, it's more like
sort
a
of rewrite.
modernization.
Yes, it's a modernization and consolidation, but we're actually creating a new Bible, so to speak.
Right.
Right? Which, even when they did the modernization of the MGA, they didn't throw out the old, right? It's not a brand-new MGA. It started with the old as
Right,
its
but our
basis.
MDP was a modernization
Yes.
based
Yes.
on the previous MDP.
Yeah.
And I would say that our 2011, 2012 initiative with the land use bylaw was really not necessarily a modernization, but a full-on amendment from the 98 land use bylaw? No, when was the land use bylaw updated?
It
prior
was
to that?
98 was the...
Last major
MDP.
Yes.
modern, no, I'm
Yeah.
talking about the land use bylaw.
Yeah.
When was the last major, pardon me, 98?
Well, it would have followed on the
Okay.
98 MDP, yeah.
So this is what you're proposing is basically a full-on modernization,
Yes.
brand-new land use bylaw.
Following an update
It's
of the
not a
MDP.
patchwork like what we've done over the last X number of years. It's the,
That's right. So these are major policy updates
Yeah.
that we're trying to do all at once to reflect the policy changes you made in the MDP,
Yep.
rather than the annual changes that we make to address things as we go along.
Yep.
Okay?
thank you.
So that is land use bylaw. Town center enhancement plan. This is one that we have talked about for a number of years. It is a priority of council. And basically, what we want to do is update it with the current situation, reflecting some of the current master planning that we have in place. and then look at that from a implementation perspective, recognizing budget limitations. Of course, the Olympic question will feature into the downtown enhancement implementation, depending on what happens with the Olympics, if we are needing celebration space and that sort of thing, that we will have to consider that. But the theory is that we shall have the answer on the Olympics prior to commencing this project, or at least prior to finalizing this project, so that we are able to have that informed view included here. I've got coexistence roundtable implementation. What's interesting here is that
I skipped over the project on 106. ACI.
Yes, I will cut. That's next. I'm just going to make a quick note on.
Okay,
yeah.
Jumping around.
So coexistence roundtable implementation. I'm mentioning it here in planning. It's not included in the planning list currently, and there's a reason for that. So historically, the sustainability coordinator has reported to planning. One of the organizational changes that we are proposing to make as part of this budget process is actually to take that from a half-time position to a full-time position, and then move that person actually to Public Works. And so where you actually find the coexistence roundtable implementation is in Public Works, but the work has currently been done for this planning in the planning department. So you'll find this particular budget line in the Public Works section, not in the planning section, but planning, because Lori Risling-Wynn has been doing this work here. So I'm just highlighting this to you now for your information. You will find the justification sheet and the actual budget line in Public Works. Yes. Okay, but that's going to be one of the structural changes we're proposing to make, is to have the sustainability coordinator actually located in Public Works, working closely with Parks and the capital project manager that we have, position that we have there, implementer, and then reporting through to manager of Public Works. Yes, John?
So at this stage, has there been any discussion with the school board about this project, or would that come later? No, but there has been initial discussions with the school board about this project, and they are open and receptive to the idea. What's interesting is that it was when Banff fenced their school, when the school board fenced the school in Banff, the school board actually paid for it, but that was quite a number of years ago. And so we have to have conversations about, because in this case, the field is actually owned by the town, and the school is owned by the school board, and so is the daycare site. And then they also have plans for, or they're discussing potential development on that southwest corner as well. So we have to engage in a sort of fulsome planning process with the school board on this, but we've had initial discussions. They recognize that this is a need. The vice principal was explaining to me that there was a day where the children were trying to get to their bikes, and she was standing between the children and the elk with her arms out. I was chased by elk on my bike trying to act as a physical barrier, and that's not a very good management plan. Okay?
I was on my bike, I was going this way, he's following, I'm going this way.
And so then, yes, we have the Alberta Conservation Association land. So this is a historical remnant, basically, when this side of the valley was originally subdivided. Mr. Kernick actually donated this land, and it went to the Conservation Association. Actually, they went to somebody else first and then to these guys. Basically, they're saying that they can't manage it. It doesn't fit with their mandate. They would like the town to take responsibility for it. So we would actually take a transfer of the land, and then we would need to do some uptake and upkeep on the land, and then do some work there. Yes.
Do we have any choice?
Yeah.
We could refuse.
So what happens to the land if we say no thanks?
So what happens if we say no thanks is that we have, they're going to essentially stop maintaining it. It does fit within our broader mandate, and you see that it's sandwiched between the two corridors. And we are trying to take an overall approach to corridor management in the area, and we're trying to work with the province on that. So yes, we could say no, but they will stop maintaining it, and we don't believe that that's a responsible way to do stewardship of that piece of land. So we actually, administration does believe that we should take the land and then incorporate that into our broader planning process for essentially Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor.
So at this time, that land is not part of the corridor, or it is?
It is.
Yeah.
So
So we would have to manage the corridor like the province is doing.
yeah, and so what's interesting is there are actually 2 parcels owned by the ACA. The other parcel is being proposed to go to the province and being added to the wildland park. And so that's the other, you can almost see the line there, unfortunately, or I think so. I tried to, if I got the mouse. So this section here is also owned by the ACA, so these 2 parcels. And we're proposing is to attach this to the wildland park of the province here, and then we would take responsibility for this section here.
Why don't they take it all?
Yeah, why don't we just,
Give them all.
the whole chunk?
So again, because it connects directly into and it's directly within the development footprint. So you can see the delineation. That other parcel is outside of the development footprint. This parcel is within the development footprint.
This is gonna give us no end of grief.
We already have no end of grief with it. We need to deal with the whole question of the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. We are attempting to do that. That is one of the things that our full-time sustainability coordinator will focus on, should that position be approved. And you know, I don't think we gain anything. The province isn't interested in taking the other parcel because it is directly within the development footprint. So I don't think we gain anything by trying to refuse to accept this parcel.
But is there ever going to be development there? No.
No.
That's what I mean, like, so it's within the urban growth, that's what I'm trying to understand, it's within the urban growth boundary.
Yes.
However, like, so, this is in, Eagle Terrace, correct? So Eagle Terrace is complete, there's not one lot left to be built.
That's right.
We could actually rescind the ASP, so this is part of what was handed over as part of the development to be, conserved.
Yeah.
To an organization that wanted to receive the land at the time. Yeah. And now.
But that organization has since gone defunct, and then it was transferred to the ACA. And so the ACA is actually much more, essentially their hunting and fishing is their, so they, their specific mandate is around preserving lands for hunting and fishing. This doesn't meet.
No, that's clear. It does not align at all with their mandate.
So they're basically saying it should go to the people whose responsibility is for managing the overall landscape in this location, and that unfortunately is split between us and the province. And so the province is taking half, and we're proposing to take the other half and include it in our solution for the Lower Silvertip.
You're taking the easy half, the cheap half.
That half, though, does actually get a lot of human use, I will say, as somebody who lives up there.
Yeah.
And the part that the province is getting is problematic as well.
Yes, it's all problematic.
We should have all the problems
We have to deal with the question of human use in the
Sal.
wildlife corridors everywhere. So adding this parcel does not significantly change that responsibility or that work.
And I would counter that, yes, we need to take responsibility for human use, but I don't know if we necessarily need to take responsibility for the lands that inappropriate human use is occurring on. That's just my 2 cents at this exact moment.
Fair enough. Ultimately, the position of administration is the ACA no longer wishes to manage these lands. They will stop to manage these lands, and if we do not accept it as a transfer, then that leaves a massive gap of unmanaged lands, which we also do not think is appropriate.
So can I just ask a question here? Because I think there's an inference that by approval of this project that we are accepting that transfer of the lands. Is there another process for accepting the transfer? Do you envision an approval of council separate?
Yes, there will.
Staff report?
We expect that there will have to be an approval of council when we take possession of the land, essentially the land transfer.
Because you know, all of the operational implications might not be clear at this point in time, and so I'm just wondering from a process perspective, if we could put some clause in this capital justification sheet that says there'll be a separate decision point on taking over that.
Yeah, I mean, so the dollars that are included in this project are for essentially the acceptance and management of the land, so some signage and trail cleanup and these sorts of things, not for the actual acquisition of the land, right? So that would be a separate process.
And I think it's proposed to come for $1, basically. It's not.
Yes.
It's not meant to.
That's right. We're not paying for the land.
Can I just ask a question? In terms of then managing these lands, the green piece of land would be managed by Alberta conservation officers. If you were going to, say, enforce off-leash dog activity, the
Yes.
green would be
Provincial responsibility.
provincial responsibility, but then the blue would be Canmore bylaw?
Yeah, and so actually, we need to be a bit more careful, because only the green on the right-hand side of the screen would be provincial responsibility. The green on the left-hand side of the screen is the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. That is actually municipal. That is our problem currently.
Oh, okay.
Not entirely. Some of it's private
Well,
land.
yes,
Some of it's
exactly.
golf course land, you know.
Yeah. The majority of it is owned by the town. There is some of it that is privately held, and some of it is actually also provincial. Yeah, okay. So those are the projects in planning. Oops. A quick discussion on facilities. So again, I would like you to just stay on the high-level sheet here, and this is page 10. So we're basically starting at the top of page 10. And I don't think we need to spend a lot of time here. So basically in 2019, we're proposing a floor machine replacement. I don't imagine there's a lot of council debate on that. We need to refurbish the Zamboni. We need to energy return unit replacement at Elevation Place, a lift for replacing arena glass, a dust filtration system improvement at Elevation Place. We need to do some R&M at the old VIC, and air conditioning unit at the CRC. And then the big project here that I want to highlight in facilities in 2019 is the EP solar project. So in fact, the big highlight that I want to raise in facilities altogether is around solar. So again, we referenced earlier the IPCC report. One of the most effective things we can do around the environment and reducing our carbon footprint is the investment in solar. Not only does it significantly reduce our carbon footprint, but we received some bad news yesterday on the budget. So we're going to have to adjust our budget by about $93,000 due to increased energy costs that we were only given notice of essentially yesterday. And so investing in solar is a significant hedge against future increases in energy costs, which we can imagine are going to continue to increase. So we've got 5 solar projects included in the capital budget in 2019 and 2020, representing a significant investment in solar. We believe that this follows up and is consistent with Council's commitment to make environmental sustainability one of their priorities. And we think that this is one of the most cost-effective ways that we can do that, with added financial benefit for the town. So the only other project that is in facilities that is really worthwhile discussing today is the fire hall. So in 2020, we have $900,000 in the budget for design of the fire hall. And in 2021, we have $12 million in the budget for construction of the fire hall. Those are placeholder numbers at the moment. They depend on a lot of things that are still to be determined. We are going to bring the fire hall study to council in December, a draft version of that for council's consideration, and then the final report will be available early in the new year. And then based on that final report, we may need to make revisions because there are 2 different scenarios that are being considered. One entails a brand new fire hall to replace the current main fire hall, and the other is looking at a secondary fire hall as opposed to a new primary fire hall. I don't think we want to go into those discussions now. There will be a separate process for making those decisions and separate reports coming to council, but facilities is carrying those numbers in their budget. Otherwise, other projects and facilities, the roundhouse, the cooling system upgrades, we have to replace the scoreboard at the CRC in 2020. And then the remaining projects in 2020 are all solar projects. And then 2021 and out, aside from the fire hall, are essentially all life cycle. They're asset replacement and building maintenance components.
On the roundhouse cooling system, so I know the town built it. It notes the school board's the head landlord. Is it worth even asking them if they would contribute to the cost of maintaining the facility?
The school board? No.
I knew the answer.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, was that ask the school board to contribute to the roundhouse?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, no.
I think I just said that.
Yeah, no,
Confusing because they're the landowner.
Yes.
they're the landowner, but they've subleased the land, or they've leased the land to us, and then we subleased to the daycare. So, yeah. So there's, you know, next to no relationship between the school board and the daycare.
Yeah. So I'd like to open it up. Any questions on the facilities budget overall?
Can I ask about the scoreboard replacement?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we do that currently with the CRC upgrades that we're doing?
So it wasn't scoped as part of that project. And if you recall, we had budget challenges with that project specifically.
So we don't need it right now? It's not a critical need?
It's basically, we've put it in the budget to be life cycled in 2020. We think that that's the appropriate time to do it.
But it's coming from the asset replacement reserve, according to this, right?
Yes, because it's an existing asset that needs to be life cycled out and replaced.
And the funding's not available in the asset replacement reserve in this particular year?
Well, it wasn't part of the capital plan, a capital project that was approved for the CRC Reno.
No, I know that,
Yeah.
because this is an additional charge.
Yes, yeah.
But we're deferring it 1 year, but it's coming from a reserve. Can we do it earlier? I'm just saying, can we do it earlier?
We could do it earlier.
In scope of
Yeah,
the
but
renewal of the CRC.
We propose to do this also in 2020 because we expect there to still be construction ongoing in 2019 in the AK, so this seemed to be the appropriate time to do it.
So it's not really ready for this
Yes.
edition yet?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good answer, thanks.
Okay.
I'm just, you know, there's a significant number of solar projects in this proposed budget, and, you know, I think Mike, in the slide that's up currently, explains part of the rationale and the initial, you know, discussion around the climate change news that, you know, that climate change is having a greater effect than initially predicted, and governments need to respond. So this is directly to respond to that call to action. But, you know, administration struggled with this. So we had it in, we had it out, we had it in. So this is where we've landed as a priority project, but certainly would like to hear council's input on it.
Is there some way to translate?
Can you press your?
Is there some way to translate that chart to dollars, so that we could look at, if we're looking at electricity offset, what are we looking at in dollar savings?
You know, it really depends on the price of power. I know when we were looking at the waste transfer station recently, the payback was 20 to 25 years.
Less than 20 years.
So, you know, as rates increase, you know, your payback time decreases.
Yeah. So, for example, this information we just got yesterday that looked at the increase essentially on the riders on the transmission rates affects our payback period. So we expect that generally around between 15 and 20 years, the system will be fully paid for by the savings, and then there will be additional savings on top of that. Right? And with the life cycle on these systems is a minimum of 25 years.
And then there's the little matter of, I don't know, saving the planet?
Right.
That little matter.
Yes.
And I'll forward to council. Yesterday, the province put out a media release about solar in Alberta and how much the industry is growing, how it's diversifying the economy, creating jobs, saving money, and impacting the environment. So I will forward that. I mean, it is a media relations piece, but there's some interesting, relevant information in
And
it.
hasn't the province increased the amount of grants?
Yes.
So presumably we'll be passing that on
Applying
to.
for some of those.
Yeah.
Just if you're looking for feedback, I didn't say anything when you were presenting that because I feel it's urgent that we should be stepping up. And Mike, you noted at the beginning that the information from the IPCC report and the obvious conclusion that it's up to government to step up. So we're looking to spend $365,000, which when compared to the future impacts of climate change, I think is moderate.
Right. So this is what we feel to be a robust part of our plan. We'll come to the organics discussion when we get to Public Works, but so this is on the facility side of things. And this makes economic sense for the town. We get an economic benefit from doing this, in addition to the significant impact that it makes on the environment. And for those two reasons, we believe that this is part of a prudent plan going forward.
So, just a question, and kind of drawing a line towards those young people that came and presented to us from, which this sort of actually draws a line, quite frankly, because most, if not all of these locations are valley bottom and have really great sun exposure. Why would Elevation Place only receive a 12% electricity offset in comparison to the senior center? I don't understand.
Because EP is such a massive consumer of energy.
Okay,
right?
So it doesn't matter how many solar panels you put up there,
that's
you're
right.
going to get a 12% offset.
The EP solar installation is budgeted at $430,000. As you can see up there, it is a massive system, 211 kilowatts.
Yeah.
That is still produces only 12% of the energy consumption at EP.
In the building, okay.
And so there's a limit to how many solar panels we can put on a roof.
Of course.
and so we're proposing to essentially maximize what we can for that facility.
Okay, thank you very much.
One of the other interesting initiatives that came from the work done by that group of students is in our discussions with the developers, with BODA, and as we're looking at the land use, we are trying to propose that for things like AESPs, think Three Sisters lands, that there be language in there that looks at the orientation of development. Same with Spring Creek, same with Silvertip. So that actually, because in the past, orientation for solar was never a consideration in how they were designing their subdivisions. And we would actually like to start to have those conversations and incorporate that as part of that discussion.
And so, is there more benefit in solaring up multifamily developments over single-family home development? So like, is that a conversation we should not just be having in terms of, in the context of an ASP, but in individual home builds as well?
Right. So there are advantages to both. There are economies of scale of doing larger facilities, but there are advantages to both. And so we are trying to encourage both.
Okay.
Right? We have the solar incentive program. It's part of the budget each year. That is, oh, it's interesting. I didn't see it.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, that was my next question. I didn't.
I believe it is in the
Is
operating
in the operating budget?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me check that. I don't know that it is actually.
Mike, do we have information on the Three Sisters area? Because it might not be solar friendly. I'm not sure we're going down the right road there.
So one of the things that we actually had those students do is they did an assessment of the entire valley. And they calculated the solar potential everywhere, not just in the valley bottom. And their study shows definitively that there is actually significant solar benefit pretty much everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Elevation Place already has solar, and so does the Waste Management Center.
Yes.
So what percentage of increase are we talking about to do both of those, or to do one or the other?
So Elevation Place has solar thermal currently, so it's a system that we use to essentially heat water. It's very effective. It actually already offsets our energy costs quite significantly. But again, the addition of this system still only accounts for an additional 12% of our energy consumption at EP.
So you would be maximizing every root pitch available for solar?
You can see the design essentially there on the bottom corner. That top section of roof, the main section of roof, we are essentially proposing to cover with panels, yes.
Okay. So that's the original system didn't cover that much of the roof?
No.
Is that what you're saying? Okay.
No. Yeah.
And the Waste Management Center as well, didn't they just did a upgrade there?
So we did add a section there. We are proposing to do further. And in addition to that, actually, when we talk about the organics, there's an additional solar project in the organics project as well. So yeah, at the time when we did the one at the Waste Center, it did not cover the the full usable space, and it did not optimize the full potential there.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yes.
Question on a project you didn't detail on page 88, the CRC air conditioning unit.
Yeah.
So on the second page, project rationale, it says this project was removed from life cycle maintenance. And then it goes on to say the rough-in for the unit will take place in the LCM project.
Yeah.
So as part of the approved project, we're doing the rough-in for the air conditioning.
So as part of the approved project, we're doing the rough-in for the installation, but we didn't actually include the air conditioning in it because of the cost and the challenges that we had with that budget.
Right. Just seems a little odd to remove it from the project at the beginning of the year or late last year and just add it right back in again.
So Lisa or Sally, you want to speak to that?
Well, I don't know if you recall when we brought this to council, this was the challenge with that budget, is that there was more need in that building than we can afford. So it's sort of similar even to the fire truck, where when we bought the truck, there was a key piece missing because we couldn't afford it, and then we bring it back in the budget year where we can. So when this came out, we knew that we were going to have to put air conditioning in at some point. It was just the question of when. So it made sense while the construction work was happening to do the rough-in, because we knew we were going to need it eventually. So there is actually some efficiency in doing it. I agree with you on the timing, but it's just the reality of budget timing.
Right. So the building will be roughed in for air conditioning. The hope is to have it installed in 2019.
I thought it was 2020. No, 2019, you're right.
2019.
Yes, 2019, yes.
As a part of the ongoing project. So effectively, we're putting it back in the project.
Essentially.
It's a different project, technically.
Yeah, but we are proposing to include it back in while the work is being done currently, yes.
Okay.
Yes, Karen?
Going back to the solar panels, I know the senior center just was reshingled.
Yep.
And it's ready. Are any of the other buildings requiring work before the solar panels go on?
No, so, and we've included that in our consideration, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had that question too, good question.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to move on because, again, we're pressed for time. Yeah, if you can grab Andy. So, engineering. The majority of engineering's work, I especially love this picture on the right-hand side. That cycle network planning is...
That's like Hamilton's.
Yes. So, Andy, this is for your benefit.
You didn't see it.
Right. Yes. So I've asked Andy to come in because we want to give council a sort of holistic overview of where we're at with the transportation network. In general, engineering, their projects are split into sort of different categories. You've got some engineering design guideline updates, and then it's a lot of transportation stuff, street and drainage rehab, Palliser Trail connection to benchlands. I'm not going to discuss each of the transportation projects individually. I'm going to let Andy go over that. Yeah, I'm basically just going to hand it over to Andy right now. Why don't you go ahead?
Good morning, Council.
Oh, thank you very much. You don't have to share with me.
I share this, then you share your... No, just kidding.
Okay.
I used to bring these first budget, and it was because everybody was sick.
So as Mr. Park suggested, I'm going to provide an opportunity to share the decision-making context and how our long-term planning has been put together for road asset management and for transportation. Just a bit of a preface. Feel free to ask any questions. They're all good questions. It's a lot of information and it's a complex puzzle, so there are no bad questions, and challenge things. This plan is a compromise. There isn't a perfect plan. There's always a compromise between timing and looking at the different safety initiatives and budgets and transportation initiatives. So that's where the discussion is useful. Ask lots of questions and challenge it. And to a large extent, these plans are flexible. We get recommendations around timing for road rehabilitations. We have recommendations around timing for transportation improvements. As I'll describe in a minute, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and there's flexibility in that, that plan. So first step is project identification, and we have a large number of sources for where projects are identified. We have council strategic planning. Maybe I should have handed those out after. What I'd suggest is the new handouts, just maybe put them to the side for a second. I'll describe what's in them as we get to them. We have community feedback. We get this through various engagement and through regular operations. We have we assess the condition of the roads and bridges, and we have our foundational plans for transportation and parking management. In addition to that, there are a number of other plans, associated plans within the organization that identify projects that are transportation related, and those feed into the overall picture. We then need to evaluate those projects, and we use a combination of qualitative and quantitative criteria for that. The criteria are developed largely out of the municipal development plan and the integrated transportation plan. Those are the bigger vision documents, and so those are the ones we lean on for defining criteria. We look at costs, so for any significant project, we put together a preliminary cost estimate. Network management, so what potential does the project have to shift mode? Does it contribute to our 2030 mode shift targets in the ITP? Does it address a traffic flow issue? Does it address parking and congestion? We look at livability. Does the project contribute to accessibility, school travel, health, cost of living, place, noise and air pollution? Economic, there's a lot of discussion in the ITP and MDP around the town center being the heart of the community. Does the project contribute to that? Does it contribute to growth? Does it enable growth and accommodate that growth? Does it contribute to the movement of goods and people? And finally, operations. What are the operations requirements for the project? Do we have rehabilitation needs that are associated? What are the ongoing operational costs? Are there greenhouse gas impacts from the project? Are there liability issues for the organization that should be addressed? So then we have a general sense of the projects in terms of the benefits towards our community goals and vision. And then we look at the jigsaw puzzle of prioritizing. When does one project go versus another project? We again review against council priorities. We try to anticipate areas of growth. We look at what funding opportunities there are. What are those funding sources? Consider our ability to deliver those projects internally. Coordinate with road, bridge, and utility rehabilitation needs, so looking at the recommendations around when those pieces get staged. Consider opportunities to leverage against developer contributions, so sometimes a project can get bumped up in timing just because of when other things are happening. Spring Creek Drive's a good example of that. And then looking at complexity. Some projects have deep and shallow utility requirements or land requirements that require multiple years of planning to address, and so those projects might show up a little later. Once we've done that within the department, we sit down, as has been described by the GMs, and look at the larger organizational needs, and there's been discussion around how that looks as a vetting process, and transportation and asset management projects get prioritized against all of the other organizational needs. So the result of that, within engineering, we have a 10-year plan where we're looking at a number of different areas, and that's what's outlined in the handout. It's just a summary of that 10-year picture with several maps that show the relative staging of the projects and the general locations of the projects. We have a number of larger complete streets projects. Those are ones that address both rehabilitation and providing for walking, cycling, transit. We have our life cycle and asset management projects. Those are largely rehabilitating the pavement surface, but might include an enhancement component or some improvements associated with it, but it's not necessarily a complete rebuild. And then we have a number of specific multimodal network improvements, so looking at closing gaps in the network, addressing acute areas of connectivity and accommodation. We also have a category for, it's the very last page, it just a few placeholders for town center enhancement and parking management, and there are a number of projects associated with that in the 6-year capital plan. For budgeting purposes, we're looking at the 6-year component of this, but the 10-year picture gives you an idea of some of the things that are either staged or fell out of the 6-year window and are being looked at as kind of the next round of priorities in that medium to long term. So short-term projects, we're proposing a project for Railway Avenue South. We've broken Railway out into sections. Each has its own unique needs and characteristics as we're finding through engagement and concept design development. The work to develop the concept is underway, and that'll be brought to council in the new year. The general footprint we're looking at is improving the connectivity to a number of bus stops that serve the 3 bus services that we have, local, regional, and intermunicipal to Calgary. This intersection has fairly poor accommodation for walking and cycling. Poor for walking, nothing for cycling, really, apart from a couple of multi-use path links. It's a big intersection, so that means it takes a long time for each signal phase, so there might be opportunities to maintain the laning and reduce the amount of delay for vehicular travel. And then the associated links in the area, there's a number of other projects I'll speak to in a moment.
Just on that South Bow Valley Trail railway project. So the diagram suggests that that's going to take in the intersection down where Shops Canmore is currently being built?
Yes, we're looking at the lane configuration, and you can't look at the lane configuration for the intersection, the main intersection, without looking at the configuration for access in and out of Shops. So they'll be looked at in conjunction. What scope extends down there will come out of the conceptual design that's being done.
So at least looking at that is in the first project, the top priority.
That's right. Next, we have Bow Valley Trail West Pathways. We've got a significant portion and a growing portion of our visitor accommodation along Bow Valley Trail. Bow Valley Trail presently doesn't have an all ages, all abilities year-round connection. That we can all visualize what that's going to look like for that west side as a first step based on what's been built in front of the hotels and at the main crossing. Completing that piece will allow us to maintain in the winter, and there's a complete description in the folder for that.
Just ask a question of what's happening currently. So it looked like Base Camp, they did the widening in front of their second building, not in front of their first.
That'll continue next year. They'll finish the remainder next year.
Okay, so that was something they had to do?
That's right. The next important area is connection of the Palliser area via Benchlands. Both from the Benchlands pilot work and from work in planning the development at Northview, this combination of projects that are in the 1920 window are important from a connectivity and a safety perspective, and so we see those as a priority. The fare-free transit and price parking option evaluation is one of Council's priorities to investigate. I don't think I touched anything. Then this was one of the ones that came up when we were talking about following changes in capital projects over the years. We've had a number of capital projects that have focused on the west end of the town center and the corridor out, the Bow Bridge corridor. There are a number of challenges on that corridor. It's highly constrained. It's a very busy corridor. There have been recommendations in the ITP that have shifted the focus from trying to move as much traffic as possible on Main Street to moving more of that on 7th and 10th Street. And so we are proposing to pilot the free flow configuration at Main Street with the north-south movements and the recommended three-way stop, or in the future that could be a number of options, most likely traffic signals. Proposing to pilot that in the short term using existing capital budgets, and we would come back with a more concrete proposal on that in the new year. In the medium term, we're looking at taking that piloted area and transitioning it to a complete street improvement. So that would be the intersections along the west side, and as I suggested, looking at some improvement to the flow of the intersection at 10th and Fairholme that accommodates transit, which is a priority for the Transit Commission, that intersection, as well as the Main Street intersection, and encourages the flow of traffic on 10th Street. Then moving on to central phases or central area of railway for complete street improvements. This corridor is relatively well connected right now. It's got reasonably good walking conditions. The vehicular accommodation is quite good in terms of level of service. So it'll be about adding in bicycle facilities and improving the operation of the intersections. Will be focused through that area. Additional pathway areas on Bow Valley Trail. The one to the east isn't, it shows up as a priority in part because there are utility, do you have a laser pointer? Sorry. Oh, there it is. There are deep utility improvements and upgrades associated with connection to the water, the pump house and our lift station for sewer. They come across Railway Avenue and make their way all the way up to the intersection with the hospital. When those are replaced, that'll provide an opportunity to backfill with good material and pave a pathway or put in sidewalk facilities on top of that reconstructed utility. And so that's planned together with the utility work in the medium term.
Would that involve ditching the ditch?
Yes.
That's exactly what people said during the public engagement with Bow Valley Trail, is to ditch the ditch.
Right. And also like to draw council's attention to what's happening on the east side of the intersection between Benchlands and Bow Valley Trail. So it's not just on the west side in front of the hospital, but that connectivity essentially in front of, starting from where Shops of Canmore is currently and going to the roundabout, there's terrible ped and cycling facilities. There's nothing there currently, essentially. And so we want to include that as part of that to improve that connectivity from the roundabout through as part of that project.
Thank you. Just on the ditch piece, there's a need to update our stormwater management study, and that's included in the budget for next year as well. So that'll be the piece that informs where does all the water go, because there's no connection between north side of the highway, TP Town hospital area, and any natural water course. So all of that water needs to infiltrate. And updating our study from earlier in the 2000s will provide us with the design for those areas, probably some linear infiltration facilities.
Andy, before you move that slide,
Councillor Sandberg?
Is there any focused attention going to be at the intersection of the Shops of Canmore and into the coast?
Yes, as part of the look at intersection of Benchlands and Railway at Bow Valley Trail, we'll extend and look out at the turn bays for Shops of Canmore.
Okay, great, thanks.
Three Sisters commuter pathway. This has been in the capital plan for for quite some time. The connectivity is there, and it's a well-used path. It's presently not fully paved. There is a lot of complexity with this path because of constraints, especially in the more south area. So there might be some opportunities with plan development out Three Sisters Way to look at improving this link. And presently it's in our medium-term plan, but I believe it's unfunded. So we'll be actively seeking funding sources for this commuter link. Second Ave rehabilitation. This provides two potential pieces. One is improved pedestrian connectivity within TP Town. It's an area that's quite close to a lot of destinations with very limited pedestrian connection. The road needs to be rehabilitated and the utilities under the road need to be upgraded. And so we've lumped those projects together and are looking at a medium-term rollout for that as a first stage of roadworks in TP Town. Then there are a variety of other walk cycle network improvements on key corridors. And intercept parking is something we've identified in that medium-term window with presently unfunded, and we're acting on it. We are prioritizing it in the short term. However, there's likely going to be some land constraints with any option we look at that requires us to get those pieces in place before we can build some intercept parking. So we're working actively on a number of sites as we speak. In the longer term, looking at the Bow Bridge corridor out to Three Sisters, Railway Avenue at the north end. I expect there to be some interest around the 17th and Railway intersection. And so this piece isn't locked in stone necessarily that we wouldn't do something with that intersection sooner. This is just a placeholder. We would like to complete a core network of bicycle facilities by 2030 and eliminate gaps and barriers in the pedestrian network by 2030 as part of targeting our mode share, as well as looking at completing integration of those various transit systems that we have, improvements to the bus stops, and start looking through studies that are being undertaken right now at potential to expand on those services. In the short term, we aren't looking at any significant expansion of existing transit services, just looking to make minor infrastructure improvements and promote the services we have. So that's the presentation, just a few notes. We have in the map that's been provided for street and drainage rehab, placeholders for funding for 3 additional years. The recommended spend is about $2 million, give or take, on road rehab each year. So between complete street work and rehab work, we've budgeted for that amount and funded that amount. Not all years are assigned in that map, so there may be others that are added based on condition assessment or council priority.
Which map are you referring to? Sorry, is it in this package?
Yes, it's the orangey brown map. We should reassess each budget cycle, our medium and longer term projects for timing based on all those factors. So things are going to move around because the myriad variables that go into decision making change with time. And as those change, you reassess, you get new condition assessment data, you get pedestrian traffic data, you use that to update your decision making. And finally, there are placeholders for town center enhancement, but what that looks like and when it's timed is to be determined. There is a capital project to look at updating that plan, which will inform those decisions, but I envision improvements starting more towards the medium term.
Just a couple of questions. The Palliser pedestrian crossing, which is a D, and put out 2024 for initial planning, so that would infer 2026 or later before something would happen there.
Most of the funding for that pedestrian bridge comes from the development that's planned on that side of the highway. And in terms of a connection, it is nearly, for Northview, it'll be about equivalent. The new Northview development and church development, it'll be about equivalent to use the new facilities on the Benchlands overpass. And that would be a significant improvement too for those that live in the existing Palliser and Hector. So that Ped Bridge, a lot of the budget and rationale for it comes from that later development.
So I'm thinking about the future affordable housing lands that we own, with or without the Olympics. I think we have to make those lands developable in the next couple of years, and I think Ped Bridge is going to be a part of that. So if we just push that conversation out for 8 years, we're not addressing the real need of making those affordable housing lands.
So there are a few answers to that. So first of all, the Olympics is a critical question, so whether or not the Olympics move forward. We are planning to update the CHAP in 2019, and through that process, it is not necessarily the case that those lands would be the next ones in the list to be developed to accommodate further affordable housing. There's some discussion around different fire hall locations and a combined affordable housing potential project there that we will look at. So that remains to be seen. But to Andy's point, the cost to put in the pedestrian infrastructure, especially if there are no Olympics, has to come from the development. So the planning window that we look at for when that development occur will inform when that project moves forward. If the development were to come forward, then we would look at moving that project forward in the plan. But it is not currently anticipated that it will happen sooner than what is in there currently, in absence of the Olympics. If the Olympics move forward, then it's a different conversation, and we would adjust accordingly.
Are you talking about the development of the affordable housing lands or Silvertip in general?
All of it. So
all of it, the whole package.
The cost to fund the pedestrian infrastructure is going to have to be spread out across all of the development. Affordable housing lands, Silvertip lands as well. And so...
Is that through the offsite levy model?
So we can't actually offsite for pedestrian improvements currently. It's something we've lobbied for, but unsuccessfully. We would more likely have to look at something like a local improvement tax or some other, potentially something through a development agreement. There are different mechanisms that we can explore, but that's where the funding is going to have to come from because it's an expensive piece of infrastructure.
So are you saying that there's a critical mass of development that has to occur before it's...
Yes, exactly. In absence of that development, we cannot move forward with the pedestrian overpass. And we don't need to. As Andy pointed out, the current development that is there will see improvements in their connectivity through the projects that are planned in the 2019 and 2020 window.
Okay, thanks.
So we'll have an opportunity to discuss this further.
Sure,
yep.
Yes. Okay. And there's one supplement I wanted to add to Andy's presentation, which is we've talked a lot about the environment and the IPCC report. The work that we're doing on the mode shift in the town isn't just about better planning of our community and the complete streets concept and managing our transportation and parking and traffic congestion issues. It's also a significant environmental factor. So we need to move people out of their vehicles when it is possible to do so, when it is appropriate to do so, for those who choose to be able to do so. And that is also a contributing factor to our environmental approach. So believe it or not, from my perspective, much of the transportation network also, this transportation planning we're doing, also contributes towards the efforts we're making on the environment. Okay. So with that, any further questions for Andy on the network while he is here? So we'll go back to the capital sheet. He is, yep.
I don't think you touched on the flood project, Andy.
No, that's separate, so I will go over that now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could I ask one more question about transportation?
Yes.
What is the Benchlands Trail uphill cycle facilities? How do you describe that?
As part of the work we've been looking at for Benchlands Trail, the pilot work that's been done around the road rehabilitation, it was identified through that process that ultimately that street needs to be made into a complete street. So it needs some form of uphill cycle facility with some separation from the vehicular traffic, especially because of the speeds and grades there. However, the rationale for doing bench lands before some of the other core improvements isn't there. So we need a improvement over the Trans-Canada Highway with the bench lands overpass. We need improvements to Railway Avenue so that you're actually connecting into something and that the demand is there to justify the expenditure. So at some point in the future, we envision making some changes to that uphill curb to widen out and create some space to put an uphill bike lane. But we're not proposing to do that now as part of the rehab project. We've evaluated it and are recommending to defer that until we have a network to tie into.
So it's just road improvements or road realignment that you're proposing there?
Now it's just essentially a mill and overlay of bench lands with no significant changes to the street configuration, because we've recognized that we can't go part way and see a benefit. We can spend a chunk of money and not see necessarily the improvements we want to see. So at some point in the future, the rationale will be there to spend that money, but for now, the other areas of the network are a higher priority, and that's where we should be spending, and we will continue to use the sidewalk for uphill cycling and make changes at the Benchlands overpass that make the multi-use path on the downhill side a better facility for going up and downhill.
Okay, thanks.
So I have a question on the Bow Bridge corridor. So that went from being urgent priority, set aside, going back to an urgent priority, set aside, it's been set aside again. So at what point would the volume of traffic inform that? And also, can you speak very briefly to things like speed limits and so forth to control volumes and to control traffic that are not necessarily part of, that would form a part of the capital plan, I guess?
What we're proposing for Bow Bridge corridor is similar to Benchlands, a focus right at the town core and then work our way out. So the initial focus is around getting the intersections working on the west end of the town center to give something to tie into. There are budgets and scope identified in the short medium term to improve some of the crossings on the Bow Bridge corridor and to begin to roll out some bicycle facilities on that corridor. That would come in the medium term window. So the initial focus close to the heart of downtown, start to work our way out, and then at some point in the medium, towards the end of the 10-year, we would take on that more complex project of a complete street rehab, which likely would come with support from and rationale from the development that's happening out in Three Sisters.
Okay.
Great question.
I just have a few quick questions. From the project sheets, number 124, the Benchlands overpass improvements. So I understand that currently 4 lanes, it's going to be reduced to, you're going to remove 2 and it'll still leave 3. So the lanes will be narrower ultimately.
That's correct. The entire intersection and Palliser Trail were constructed to that vehicular utopia that Alberta Transportation envisions for us. However, it's the capacity from a 3-lane cross-section where you have 2 through lanes plus turn bays, and that could be 3 or 4 lanes at an intersection, is the exact same as a 4-lane configuration. So we're reducing the number of lanes to be able to widen out without expanding the bridge, to create some facilities on both sides of the road, which really helps with the connections down to Palliser. And at the intersections, we've done the modeling out to 2030 and beyond to determine what kind of space is required in terms of lane configurations. And so, at least for the foreseeable future, what we're proposing for this immediate term project will work through development of the Stoneworks Creek lands and development of Silvertip. They've anticipated that in their modeling, and the lane configuration that we're proposing will function.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just be quick. Project on page 134, talks about mid-block parklets or public patios. So just describe to me what a mid-block parklet looks like.
It can look like a variety of things. Generally speaking, the elements that communities have installed to create public space in their downtowns include some form of public seating. In our cases, they may create some opportunities for safe crossing of the mid-block, so not requiring that old school thinking of making pedestrians walk circuitous routes, let them get across to the stores and shops. It can include some green space. It can include additional bicycle parking. It can include patios or public art. And so there's a collaboration there with the BRZ and some sponsor businesses to determine exactly what it looks like, but the fundamental idea is to break up the line of car parking, create some additional public space, potentially create some additional bicycle parking area.
So that those sorts of opportunities, would they be envisioned for like in the middle of the roadway or on the sidewalk?
On the side.
Pardon me?
In the same way a patio is constructed, it would just be more open for general public use as opposed to being associated with a seating area.
So it would encroach into the parking lane or whatever?
It would be in the parking lane where
Sort
it would
of
be
like a bulb out in the middle of the road, like
Yeah.
they have in Banff with the crossings and a few seats and.
We have a number of them actually already. There's the one by, not by the Buffalo Road, but the bump out there's a couple of seats and
Yeah.
and with the concrete curve.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what I thought, but that seems like the first generation of what I would think of moving forward, based on what you described.
They'll still be pilotish in nature because it's not enough money to actually make any meaningful transformation of the street, but it's a continued stepwise evolution of Main Street from a place to park and convey cars to
Place to be.
Place to be.
I'm just trying to reconcile your presentation and your naming convention here with what is in the on here, and I'm having some difficulty. So 8th Avenue West Town Center, you were showing sort of that, it looked like a stoplight at the top right corner, is that correct? Is that what's short to medium term, and is that something that is in this plan?
It's Town Center West within the capital binder, and it's in 2022, 1.5 million.
Okay, so there's no detail sheet, okay.
That's right. Anything, and that's in part why I've been developing this, is the detail sheets are only 2-year.
Right.
This provides a bit longer term
Right.
picture.
So then how do you define your time frame as short, medium? So none of your sort of long-range projects then are within the 6-year window? Those are outside of the 6-year window?
They're just outside, so they'd be in the 10, give or take, year window.
Okay.
They're kind of the next priorities after this budget, so that council has the context of, okay, what's fallen off but still a priority and important in that 10-year window.
And what the overall network will look like when it's actually built out, because if you're only doing it piecemeal and you're only approving piecemeal, it's hard to envision what the whole thing will look like.
Right. So things that are listed as short or medium term should be in the 6-year plan.
Correct.
I should be able to see them in the 6-year plan.
Correct.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you.
John?
Mayor Boring?
Just one other question about the future park and ride locations. That's not in the budget yet. When will we hope to see that in the budget?
So it is in the budget. It's currently a D project.
Pardon me?
There is intercept parking in the budget currently. It's just currently listed as a D. And it's in 2021, I believe, for 1.5 million.
There won't be a sheet for it?
There's no.
On this sheet, John, it's right here. In 2021, it's not part of the 2-year.
Where is it on the sheet?
Just below 144 on page 11.
Yeah.
Intercept parking, yeah.
Oh, okay.
1.5 million in 2021.
Okay, in this sheet, it calls it a park and ride, so
Correct.
I wasn't connecting the two.
So presently, we're looking at both locations and potential funding sources and potential synergies for a parking area with transit and snow storage. And so that complete picture will be brought back to council at some point in the future when we have enough pieces together to get a council decision.
So council's put a 4-year strategic plan. Not everything that is in your strategic plan we can do in the first 2 years of the 4-year plan, right? So we've got some of these projects like that one. It's currently a D, it's unfunded. When we do the new round of budgeting in 2020, at that point we anticipate that some of these pieces, then this information that Andy is talking about, will be available, and then we can look at that project again and decide whether or not it comes out of the D category or whether we found a funding source for it, or et cetera. Right? But we can't necessarily implement all of the priorities all within the first 2 years of the 4-year plan.
I know.
Okay, we are already out of time, and I haven't even gotten to Public Works yet.
No.
So Andreas is going to do the utility stuff.
I think we'll have to do it then, his facilities is here, they need to flip this room for 1 o'clock.
Okay. All right, and we didn't actually finish with engineering because we didn't have a chance to talk about the flood. Yeah, okay, 2 minutes. So on the, essentially there's only one project in the capital plan currently that looks at the flooding picture. So we've got Cougar Creek, which is already approved. We've got a number of projects that we are working on currently. Andy, you can stick around for this if you've got a minute. But what we've got is 3.5 million out in 2022. And maybe Andy, you can speak to all what is included in that since you're standing right here.
Sure. Before I speak to the specific one, the idea is that we're similar. We have a 10-year plan. We've assessed all of our hazards and risks in the community, and within that 10-year plan, we would like to try to work towards getting our existing risk for existing development down to within tolerable and acceptable thresholds. That requires several projects, Cougar Creek, Stoneworks Creek, Three Sisters Creek, as our top priorities. So this project is Three Sisters Creek. There is also some work required on Stone Creek and potentially XYZ creeks. And those would come in the 7 to 10 year window is when we would anticipate both the opportunity to get community resiliency funding and to have the resources to be able to deliver those projects based on what we currently have on our plate.
Should the Olympics proceed, and just in also thinking about the developability of our CCHC lands in the Palliser area, the future, so you had mentioned these flood projects are specifically intended to protect existing development. So similar to the pedestrian overpass, I'm assuming that any kind of flood infrastructure that's required to protect future development would have to come at the time that that future development is proceeding.
That's the way our MDP is written. That's the way all the granting programs are written. There's no funding to protect future development. And so our focus is entirely on protecting for existing development. That said, we anticipate development happening in Stoneworks, and so the first phase of work is intended to be built on with a second phase that would permit future development. And if the timing works out for those two, they theoretically could be built at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
At some point, can we get an update on how the permitting and everything is going for Cougar Creek?
Yes.
Yep.
Because that was a big budget item for 2018, correct?
I believe that we are planning to come to the December Committee of the Whole.
January.
Was it January? Oh yeah, that's right, we moved to January. But we're actually expecting to hear something from the NRCB this week, potentially.
Okay.
Getting down to the short strokes now.
No, okay.
Yes.
Those are some big eyebrows.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so that's essentially the overview of engineering. Were there any other questions on the specific engineering projects?
There will be.
Okay. But not now.
No.
No.
All right, well then I suggest that we'll stop there for today, and we will pick up with Public Works when we bring in Andreas for the utility stuff.
Okay, motion to adjourn. Those in favor? Thank you.